Order. Order. We now come to the first Opposition Day motion on universal credit and working tax credit. Selected the amendment in the name of the Prime Minister. I call Jonathan Reynolds to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I stand here today to move the motion on the order paper in my name and those of my honourable friends opposing the reduction in universal credit and working tax credit that is set to take place in April of this year. In doing so, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I am not here today to claim that Conservative MPs are heartless or lack compassion or somehow they have insufficient regard for the poorest people in this country. I know that after the vote on free school meals, many Conservative MPs, mainly after comments made by Conservative MPs themselves, received a high degree of personal abuse, and I want to make unequivocally clear that is wrong. What I am here to do is put forward a clear and I believe compelling case that reducing universal credit and working tax credit this April would be fundamentally the wrong decision. It would be a profound mistake for families, for the economy, and for our ability to effectively tackle and recover from the COVID pandemic. Before I do so, there has been a suggestion from the Prime Minister that Parliament is somehow not the right place to have this discussion. Opposition days have been a feature of our parliamentary system for many decades now. They have been used by the Conservative Party when they've been in opposition very successfully, such as when the Labour government was defeated over resettlement rights for Gurkhas in 2009 or over post office closures. All majority governments, except this one, have accepted that if you cannot win a vote in Parliament on one of your policies, then you have to change that policy. And it's not the case that this decision could be deferred to a budget because the government cancelled the November budget and hasn't brought forward a finance bill since March. So I put it to all members that Parliament is exactly the right place to have a discussion of such consequence to the country. And the government cannot expect to preach parliamentary sovereignty one week and then run away from parliamentary scrutiny the next. Too often, this Prime Minister seems unwilling to abide by basic democratic norms and to accept proper scrutiny and accountability. And we have seen in the US where that can end. Let me also say at the outset, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that throughout the pandemic, the opposition has always sought to be constructive. As the official opposition, we want the national strategy to succeed. In that spirit, we welcomed the changes that the government made to universal credit at the beginning of the crisis. The £20 a week weekly increase and the suspension of conditionality and the minimum income floor were necessary steps to support people. Recognition must also go to frontline DWP staff who kept our social security system going through the early stages of the crisis, making sure that hundreds of thousands of new claimants received the support that they needed. All of those staff deserve our praise, from the civil servants working in the department to the security guards I met with recently who face very difficult working conditions keeping job centre pluses open. But the fact that such urgent changes were required just to provide a basic safety net is a telling assessment of where the social security system was when we went into the crisis. If we cannot properly support people in a time of need without emergency surgery to the system, then it is not fit for purpose. And the fact is that levels of support for people in this country when they lose their jobs or can't work are significantly lower than in comparable European countries. Today I'm going to address 3 points: how we got here, the case for reversing this cut to secure our economy, and finally the human impact if the government refused to change course. Not a good way on that point.
Would he accept that a really pressing reason for having this debate and a vote on this issue today is the fact that all of the evidence suggests that the restrictions which have been caused as a result of the measures taken to deal with COVID have hit the poorest in society hardest. Poverty is up, and those people who most depend upon this kind of support are the ones who are most damaged at the moment.
Agree with the statement the honourable member has made. I think inequality and the differential impact on people have been one of the defining features of this crisis. I don't think anyone can avoid that. I think it's relevant to make that point in this debate. But I also think we have to be honest about the state of our social security system going into the crisis. Since 2010, poverty has increased significantly in the UK. In addition, people who were in poverty in 2010 are now so much deeper in poverty than they were. Now, this is not an argument about definitions. Conservatives themselves were driving influences behind things like the Social Metrics Commission, which came up with a new definition of poverty, actually very similar to the one that has always been traditionally used. The government's own estimate is that 4.2 million British children live in poverty. Now, that's shameful, it's wrong, and it's unnecessary. The UK, along with Ireland, is an outlier compared to the rest of Europe when it comes to inequality. And it means the reality for millions of families is that they went into this crisis already under significant pressure. As the Resolution Foundation said in 2019, the increase of 1.7% to universal credit that year was the first working age benefit increase for 5 years. It means that last year, the real value of basic out-of-work support was lower than it was when John Major was Prime Minister. So anyone claiming that the system is too generous or trying to resurrect the stigmatising rhetoric of George Osborne simply has no case to make. I'll take that point.
He's a reasonable man, as the shadow spokesman. I like him, and he's making a sensible speech. While we're being honest about social security systems, if the Labour Party had won the general election in December 2019, is it still the opposition's policy to abolish universal credit, given that it is widely accepted to have been successful in the way that it has flexed, to expand, given the current crisis? Is it still Her Majesty's opposition's policy to abolish the entire system, and what does it propose to put in its place?
Yes, it is our policy to replace universal credit, not to abolish the welfare state, as some of those videos from Conservative Central Office have tried to make out today. But I'll be happy, after I address the causes and the question we've got before us today, to talk about what I believe are some other problems that go beyond the core amount of universal credit and why I feel replacing universal credit is the right policy. But before we get to that point, I have to stress that if this cut goes ahead, it will leave unemployment support at its lowest level ever relative to average earnings. Now, that isn't just morally unjustifiable. It's economically incompetent. Cutting unemployment support in the middle of a recession is always the wrong choice, which is why no government has done so since the Great Depression. I'll give way on that point.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman and also for his tone at the beginning of this debate. Just for our understanding of the proposal, does the opposition propose to make this increase permanent? And if so, how do they propose to pay for it?
Grateful again for the intervention. So we believe this uplift should stay in place during the crisis, and I don't think anyone believes the crisis will end in April. I will make some points about the long term near the end of my speech and why I think the whole system requires much more considerable reform than just tinkering around with the core amount. On the cost of paying for all of this, this is a significant cost. It's around £6 billion. That would vary depending on the levels of unemployment that we would see throughout the year. But I would say to all honourable members, any measure right now that cut public spending or raise taxes in the middle of what is the biggest economic downturn for 300 years would be the wrong policy. There will be decisions that will be made, I think, as we get into the middle of this decade, that will have to address the levels of debt that have been accrued by the government during this crisis. But that isn't the right choice now. But I want to focus on the point that she has raised, because I want to say if the government is seriously thinking about economic recovery, cutting universal credit is like pulling the rug from under the economy's feet. This £20 a week, it's not saved by families. It's spent. It's spent in shops and businesses across the country, stimulating the economy. Now, we all agree that this pandemic and the unemployment crisis will not be over by April this year. And whatever protestations we've heard on social media or in the press, and frankly, however people vote today, I know there are many people on the benches opposite who agree with this case. The former Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, the member for Preseli, Pembrokeshire, recently said this: withdrawing the uplift would reduce the spending power of people on the lowest incomes. This will likely reduce consumption, meaning families going without essentials and household debts rising. It would also see a reduction in spending just when the economy needs it most. Now, I couldn't agree more with that assessment. I also think he's right to draw attention to the levels of personal debt for some households. Because as well As the real value of benefits being historically low as we went into this crisis, the pandemic has meant very real additional costs for most families. There are more meals to cook at home. There are more days to heat your house. Having devices and lights on at times you wouldn't normally, and buying what you need to teach your children at home. The clinically vulnerable have been forced to buy food locally at higher cost than it is in larger supermarkets. And everyone has experienced the pandemic differently, but for some these costs have piled on. Citizens Advice told me this week that 3/4 of the people they help with debt who currently receive universal credit and working tax credit would have a negative budget if the £20 were cut. That means they'll have less money coming in than they do going out. They won't be able to cover basic essentials such as food or heating, and that will come at a time when 1 in 3 households have lost income because of COVID and 7.3 million people are behind on their bills. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the proposed cut to universal credit and working tax credit isn't the only issue causing consternation in the country right now. In particular, I want to highlight the continuing injustice of those people on ESA, Employment Support Allowance, and Job Seekers Allowance who didn't even get the uplift to begin with. I find this unjustifiable and discriminatory, and I would ask the Minister if he would mind specifically referencing this point in the government's front bench speeches. But reversing the April cut to universal credit is a specific, clear and unavoidable decision that needs to be taken. And that is why it is right to be bringing it to Parliament today. Some of the speeches we will hear today will no doubt say we should focus on jobs and getting people back to work and not on social security. The Prime Minister said something on these lines at the Liaison Committee last week. But members will know universal credit is an in-work as well as an out-of-work benefit. 40% of universal credit claimants are in work, so this argument doesn't work at all. And to be frank, it would be helpful if someone told the Prime Minister this. Universal credit is also means tested, so if people go back to work and don't qualify for it, they won't receive it at all. And if we want to have a serious discussion about boosting employment and making work pay, let's discuss work allowances and the taper rate and deductions. But let's not try and use that as an excuse by the government to do the wrong thing on this cut. Now, others might say support should be more targeted, that the basic allowance is the wrong element to target. Well, in that case, the government would logically scrap the 2-child limit or the benefit cap, which disproportionately affect people in the most difficulty, which are larger families in areas with higher housing costs. But when we put that forward, it too was rejected. Finally, there has been a proposal for a one-off payment to compensate people affected by this cut. This is an awful idea. It doesn't address the real terms reduction in support, just as unemployment is expected to peak. But more than that, whilst 6 million families are affected by this now, that cohort will change in composition throughout the year. A one-off payment based on who is eligible now will fail to support some of the people who need that help the most. So please, Minister, ask the Chancellor to think that one through again. Now, I know it sometimes frustrates Conservative members that we are still determined to replace universal credit altogether, the question I was asked earlier. But I would say to Conservative colleagues, if you won't listen to the opposition front bench, read the work of the Cross-Party Work and Pensions Select Committee. Read the report of the Cross-Party House of Lords Economic Affairs Committee, chaired by Lord Forsyth, which are clear and robust in their highlighting of the fundamental problems that currently exist. The 5-week wait, the 2-child limit, the erratic assessment period, the problems with paying for childcare in arrears, the shocking design that means many disabled people are worse off on universal credit. The last one of those is very personal to me, and it simply isn't right to not replicate how severe disability premium worked under the previous arrangements. And all this means that universal credit's brand is severely tarnished. And if everything was working, as well as ministers sometimes say, would we really be a country where food banks have gone from being a niche form of support, mainly for those without recourse to public funds, to a mainstream and essential method of keeping people fed? Would we have had the fundamental increase in child poverty, which is getting bigger with every year of Conservative government? These are questions that deserve answers. Throughout the crisis, the government has often been behind the curve, never out in front, and they've left some decisions, such as on furlough extension, to the very last minute in a reckless game of brinkmanship. And that is heavily why we have, tragically, the highest death toll in Europe, and the biggest economic downturn of any major economy. Let's not repeat that with this decision. We all know families are looking at us, wondering what we will do to help get through this crisis just that little bit easier. What they don't expect is government making it even harder. And I would hope that one thing we can all agree on is that the crisis has shone a light on some of the problems in the UK, problems that have made tackling the pandemic harder and provoking a discussion about what kind of society we want to rebuild when the pandemic is over. If it really is the ambition of Conservatives to level up the UK, it's hard to see how they can support a cut which would be so regressive to low-income families and which disproportionately affects the places the government say they want to help. Families like Bethany and a child in Blackpool who said to me, I was made redundant due to coronavirus. As a single parent to a 1-year-old, universal credit is now the only income I receive. If the government does cut £20 a week, I'll become one of the statistics needing to use a food bank. It devastates me to think that I will not be able to provide for my child should this decision be finalised. Or Margaret, who has been volunteering at a food bank in Luton. She says a young man came in for a food parcel. He looked thin and his face was grey. He sat down and he said he thought he could last with no food until the universal credit came through, but he found that he couldn't. He'd come in on a Wednesday and his universal credit was due on the Friday. Now that is the reality before the cut has gone ahead. My inbox is full of personal accounts like these. I'd urge every member to go and look at what's in their inbox and read the human cost of what it will be like for people if this cut goes ahead. Address the worries people have about not being able to put food on the table and think long and hard about the uncertainty and the fear all families face after 10 long, hard months of this pandemic. I want to make a special appeal to the new MPs on the benches opposite, whose constituents elected them in good faith for the very first time in 2019. Now, many of those people are the first Conservative to ever be elected to those places. They've already made history, and their success is a significant personal achievement. They'll be remembered, but so will their votes. And most of all, when thinking about how to cast a vote today, I urge everyone to take a moment to reflect on what this cut will mean to the people who send us here. The uncertainty it will add in an already uncertain time. The loss it will bring when we have already lost so much. The fear it will cause when what people need is hope. So for our constituents, for the economy, and for the national interest, we need to cancel this cut. And I ask every member of this House today to support our motion to do so. Thank you.
The question is, as on the order paper, and before I call the Minister, just 3 points to make. Number one is, as people can see here on the Annunciator, I'm not so sure at home, that there is a 3-minute limit on backbench contributions. For those who are contributing outside the chamber, there is a timing clock, which you should be able to see on the bottom right hand of whatever device you're using. It would be a lot cleaner if members could bring their contributions to a close before the 3-minute limit is up. Otherwise, you will be intervened upon by the chair. And for the convenience of everyone as well, the question will be put at 7:15. That's 7:15 before we then move on to the next business. Will Quince.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I welcome today's debate. It gives me the opportunity to highlight some of the unprecedented support this government has provided to people right across our country who have been affected by COVID-19. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I can confirm the amendment in the name of the Prime Minister will not be moved this afternoon. Without doubt, this has been a challenging time for many. That is why, since the start of this pandemic, we have mobilised our welfare system like never before in modern times, with a wide-ranging package of measures worth over £7 billion. Members across this House will raise the future of the £20 per week uplift to universal credit, which I will come on to shortly. I want to start by talking about how well the Department and universal credit has stood up to the challenge of the pandemic. Many people have sadly lost their jobs as a result of the pandemic or seen their incomes reduced. Universal credit and the government's investment in the welfare safety net has been there to help catch many of those affected. That has been hugely important for the 3 million more people who have made a benefit claim since March last year. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, I am so incredibly proud of how thousands of work coaches in job centres up and down our country have responded at speed and scale to ensure that we have supported those additional people in their hour of need, especially as the number of people on UC rose from 2.9 million last February to nearly 6 million in November. Through our £895 million investment, we are well on the way to meet the government's pledge to recruit 13,500 new work coaches by the end of the financial year. Of course.
Thank the Minister for giving way. This morning I chaired a meeting of the Northfield COVID Recovery Strategy Group with Becky from NCP in Northfield. And we learnt this morning that in Birmingham and Solihull we're going to see an extra 430 work coaches, 24 of which will be based at the Longbridge Job Centre. And does he agree with me that this is a perfect example of how the government is taking a proactive approach to making sure that we get people back to work as quickly as possible?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and he's absolutely right that not just in his constituency, but constituencies up and down this country in our Job Centre Plus network, dedicated work coaches have worked so incredibly hard to process an unprecedented number of claims, and they stand ready to help support people back into work. And that is exactly, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Deputy Speaker, why we have secured this additional investment from Her Majesty's Treasury to, in effect, almost double the number of work coaches across our network, across our country. Mr. Deputy Speaker, moving on to talk specifically about work coaches. They are just one part of the jigsaw. The other is the universal credit system itself. Universal credit has without doubt stood up to the challenge of COVID-19, whereas the previous legacy benefit system would have buckled under the pressure. Millions more were able to access financial support, which is fairer and more generous than the legacy benefit system. And we have made the processing of claims and paying people quickly the top priority for this department. And over 90% of new claims received their payment in full and on time. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we have a modern, dynamic, agile, fairer welfare safety net that in the face of unprecedented demand ensured millions of people were paid in full and on time. So what, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is the position of the party opposite? It's to scrap it. Yes, of course.
Giving way. Is it now the policy of the department, as the Prime Minister suggested at the liaison committee last week, that people should move from legacy benefits to universal credit in order to gain the £20 per week increase? And if that is now the policy, what about the position of those who've been receiving severe disability premium who are not allowed to move to universal credit?
Speaker, I thank my right honourable friend, the chairman of the Select Committee, for that intervention. I'd be very happy to meet with him alongside the Minister for Disabled People to discuss in particular those in receipt of the severe disability premium. But yes, Mr. Speaker, it is Mr. Deputy Speaker, it is the position of Her Majesty's Government that we want more people to move over from legacy benefits, including working tax credits, onto universal credit, because it is our modern, more dynamic benefit system. It is the future. But what I would say, and this is a very important caveat, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I would encourage anybody looking to move over from legacy benefits to universal credit to first go on to gov.uk and check their eligibility, because it's an important point to note, and I know the chairman of the Select Committee knows this well, that on application for universal credit, your entitlement to legacy benefits will cease. So it is very important that people do check. Mr. Deputy Speaker, as I say, we have a modern, dynamic, agile, fairer welfare safety net that in the face of unprecedented demand ensured millions of people were paid in full and on time. Therefore, it's quite astonishing, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that the position of Her Majesty's opposition is to scrap it, a system that by any measure has passed the most challenging of tests. And briefing to the papers, Mr. Deputy Speaker, this weekend, with a press release titled "Cut to Universal Credit to Hammer Families in Marginal Conservative Seats," playing politics with the lives of nearly 6 million vulnerable people, rather than focusing on helping them through this pandemic. So we'll take no lectures whatsoever, Mr Deputy Speaker, from the party opposite on universal credit. There is little doubt that had we relied on the legacy benefit system, we would have seen queues down the streets outside job centres and long delays leaving families facing financial disruption without support. Yes, of course.
As he's raised press speculation, will he comment on the press speculation, the news in the papers at the weekend, that the reason he is here and not the Secretary of State is that the Secretary of State agrees with us and it's the Treasury that was behind this cut of £20 a week from April?
Mr Deputy Speaker, I thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention. The reason I am here today, Mr Deputy Speaker, responding to this debate is I am the Minister for Universal Credit. And this is a debate about the £20 per week uplift to universal credit. And yes, the Secretary of State is in active discussions with Her Majesty's Treasury, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and of course the Prime Minister about how best to continue to support the most vulnerable and disadvantaged and lowest paid and poorest in our society, as the Chancellor has consistently done throughout this pandemic. I do give way.
And for giving way. So can he just confirm that the conversations are still ongoing, and one of the reasons for this is because it does need to be fully costed. It is a lot of money, and I was hoping from the Shadow Minister that he would lay out how they intended to pay for this uplift.
Mr Deputy, I thank my honourable friend for that intervention. She's absolutely right. Maintaining the uplift would be a huge amount of money, somewhere in the region of £6 billion. But it's not just about that, Mr Deputy Speaker. Throughout this pandemic, we have always looked at how best to support the poorest, most vulnerable and disadvantaged in our society. And because it is an ever-emerging and changing situation, that is the very nature of a pandemic, we have to keep everything under review. And that is why, yes, the Secretary of State and the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Prime Minister meet regularly to discuss all of these issues. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, I want to just make one further point, because it was raised by the chairman of the Select Committee. Yes, we will continue the rollout of universal credit as we committed in our manifesto, ensuring those on legacy benefits and working tax credits are moved across by 2022. Now, I will now, Mr Deputy Speaker, turn now specifically to the UC uplift. The party opposite, Mr Deputy Speaker, is quite simply wrong in their use of emotive language that the government plans to cut universal credit. The £20 per week uplift to universal credit and working tax credit was announced by the Chancellor as a temporary measure in March 2020. This additional support increased the universal credit and working tax credit standard allowances by up to £1,040 for a year. Now, we took this approach, Mr Deputy Speaker, in order to give those people facing the most financial disruption the financial boost that they needed as quickly as possible. Now, the agility and flexibility of the universal credit system allowed us to implement this vital increase rapidly and was hugely successful in giving claimants, many of whom, incidentally, Mr Deputy Speaker, had not interacted with the DWP before, a foundation with which to navigate the uncertainty of the beginning of this pandemic and to, in many ways, lessen the drop in earnings. Now, the Chancellor has always been clear that this measure remains in place until the end of the financial year. Now, I hear the calls, Mr Deputy Speaker, from the party opposite and indeed from the honourable gentleman for a decision now on whether universal credit and the uplift is continued post-April. And I have sympathy with the argument that it would give claimants certainty. However, one of the evident features of a pandemic is uncertainty. If the honourable gentleman opposite is certain about what the economic and social picture will look like in April, well, to be frank, he must have a crystal ball. The reality is we simply do not know what the landscape will look like, and that is why it's right that we wait for more clarity on the national economic and social picture before assessing the best way to support low-income families moving forward. Now, why is that important, Mr Deputy Speaker? One word: agility. The poorest and most disadvantaged in our society are best served by a government that has the agility to respond to emerging situations and the facts at the time. None of us in this House can say with any certainty what the economic landscape will be like in April. And that's why we continue to work with Her Majesty's Treasury on the best way to support those in receipt of benefits. And I would add one more thing, Mr Deputy Speaker. I know my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, well. And I put it to honourable members that throughout this pandemic, he has consistently stepped up to support individuals' jobs and livelihoods. This is the Chancellor who created the furlough scheme, the self-employment income support scheme, the Chancellor who uprated universal credit by £1,040 this year, lifted the local housing allowance by £1 billion, protected renters from eviction, protected homeowners, gave grants to businesses, supported rough sleepers to get off our streets, funded the local welfare assistance scheme to the tune of £63 million, and the £170 million COVID winter grant scheme. This represents, Mr. Deputy Speaker, one of the largest and most comprehensive support packages in the world.
Sammy Wilson.
And I think that everyone in this House must acknowledge the work which the government has done to try and help people through the economic difficulties caused by the response to the pandemic. But would he accept that even with the best will in the world, he cannot say that after April, everything is going to be rosy? We know there's going to be a long tail of businesses who have been damaged during this pandemic, have been damaged by the lockdowns, and people, especially in the low paid end of the market, are going to find themselves still in need of support. And therefore, it's wrong to say that somehow or other, from the 1st of April, things are going to be rosy, and the level of support which is required to the lowest paid in society will no longer be needed.
I don't think, I thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention, but I don't think anybody is saying that. I think we're saying that the situation remains unclear, and therefore the Chancellor of the Exchequer in particular needs the agility to be able to act based on the information as it is at the time. And what I would say, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Chancellor of the Exchequer has an unenviable task. But I would just repeat a point I made just a moment ago, that my right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, has a proven track record of stepping up to support the poorest, most vulnerable and disadvantaged throughout this pandemic. And I have absolutely no doubt that he will continue to do so. The Chancellor has consistently, throughout this pandemic, acted with the necessary agility to support and wrap our arms around those who needed it. But, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Chancellor has always said, sadly, we cannot save every job or every business. That is why getting Britain back to work is the relentless focus of the Secretary of State, myself, and the entire ministerial team at the Department for Work and Pensions. It is key to our national recovery. And it's why we're investing billions of pounds to secure that economic recovery. Through our plan for jobs, we are injecting billions of pounds worth of support and have launched a range of employment schemes and programmes. To conclude, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we have demonstrated during the pandemic this government is committed to supporting the most vulnerable in our society and into ensuring people have the right levels of support. Through universal credit and our plan for jobs, we are supporting people of all ages to gain the right skills and experience to support them back to work. We know how quickly things can change with this virus. The new variant has led to increased challenges, but there is also now real hope from the rapid vaccine rollout, which promises to have a hugely positive impact on the way ahead and getting us back to normal and our economy growing again. As the government has done throughout this crisis, we will continue to carefully look at the changing impact from the virus on public health and on our economy to help inform how we can continue to support people and give them the tools that they need to move into the workplace so the country can build back better after the pandemic.
For the avoidance of doubt, the Minister has not moved the selected amendment. The question before the House remains that already proposed as on the order paper. Video link, Neil Gray.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to go into detail this evening about why the SNP have been at the forefront of the campaign, led by the likes of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, Save the Children and others, to keep the £20 per week uplift to universal credit and extend it to legacy benefits. I want to begin by commending the UK government for taking the action that it did to uplift universal credit by £20 per week. It has undoubtedly been an important step in protecting some, but not all, of social security recipients who otherwise would have either fallen into poverty or deeper into poverty during this pandemic. It was the right thing to do, and it is right that it is now kept. Indeed, the universal credit uplift should continue for the foreseeable future. I would encourage the UK government to make that commitment now and provide the reassurance many people are looking for. Not my words, but those of the Honourable Member for Murray, leader of the Tories in Scotland, back in October. And what has changed since then? Both the health and economic aspects of the pandemic have got worse. The need is still there. And I'll tell you part of the reason why. And this is where I have to take slight exception to the motion from the opposition. It says they want the UK government to give certainty today to the 6 million families for whom it is worth an extra £1,000 a year. But while I support the motion, this uplift is only worth £1,000 per year extra if taken in isolation. Actually, when you look at cuts to social security since 2010, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation have calculated that even with the £20 uplift, families unable to find work will on average receive £1,600 less per year in social security support than they would have done in 2011, even with the support, even with the uplift. Those with children will receive £2,900 less. Now, this contrast is even more stark for larger families with 3 or more children who will lose £5,500 each year. That is part of the reason why this initiative is so important. The UK government seem intent on cutting the temporary uplift at the end of March, meaning families will be a further £1,000 per year worse off. That would give this UK government an unenviable record. If they go ahead with this cut, they will be responsible for cutting out-of-work support to its lowest level since 1992 and its lowest ever level relative to average earnings. Social security spending is normally counter-cyclical, so expenditure automatically rises during an economic downturn whilst revenue from taxation falls. This government is trying to cut support during an economic downturn when more people need greater support. And let us remember what this actually means to the people who need this support. 6 million households in every constituency in the UK, but also the millions more on legacy benefits, disproportionately sick and disabled people who have been cruelly denied the uplift. Last week, I chaired an evidence session of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Poverty, which I co-chair with the Honourable Member for Thurston Malton. And we heard powerful testimony from 2 women who are on legacy benefits and haven't benefited from the uplift. I want to read you some of what Michelle told us, because it should be heard today by colleagues across the House, by ministers on the Treasury bench, especially the Chancellor. And it should be heard because when she spoke, Michelle had millions of others behind her in the same position. My name is Michelle, and I'm currently a single parent to 2 children aged 12 and 7. I've been in receipt of legacy benefits for 7 years. Prior to this, I was a working woman with a career in finance, a taxpayer. Due to my health issues, I currently receive the legacy benefits of income-based employment and support allowance, child tax credit, and of course, child benefit. April 2020 saw a rise of 1.7% to legacy benefits. Living on social security is incredibly challenging for families. It provides less than minimum expectations of living. During the pandemic, those challenges have been magnified with social restrictions and homeschooling. £20 sounds so little, but it means so very much. I became interested in why we had not received it. In November 2020, I emailed my MP about the £20 uplift and legacy benefits, and she in turn inquired with the DWP about the situation. I was pleased to have received a response from both, but still somewhat downhearted at how little they understood of the situation. The main recommendation from my MP and the DWP was to consider applying for universal credit at this time to obtain the £20 uplift. Now, is the suggestion that people on legacy benefits request to be migrated to universal credit a feasible option, you might ask? For me, to risk weeks of zero income for my family would be totally impossible and have knock-on effects of missed bills and potentially surviving on whatever charity we have not already exhausted. I cannot, as a responsible mother, take that risk. I was also informed by my MP that those on legacy benefits may have benefited from other support, such as mortgage holidays and income protection schemes. She also mentioned increases to housing allowance. I am eligible for none of these and have no options to move home. I do not qualify for a council house, despite being in an overcrowded home in poor repair that I can barely afford. I cannot afford to rent, nor would I likely be accepted. These suggestions are not a solution to the problems we face. As it stands, being prohibited from accessing the £20 uplift pushes me further into using credit for everyday expenses, such as the weekly food shop and utilities. Therefore, I pay interest on food, heat, water, light, shoes. So what would £20 a week, equivalent to just under a month of benefits, which I calculate at £1,040 in total, over 10% of my income, mean to my household? It's hard to pick just one thing. There are numerous options. Food is usually one of the few bills parents have the ability to reduce in hard times. So to give more food security and reduce the reliance on cheap processed food would be a big benefit. Being able to warm the house, keep the house warm, would help my arthritis and the asthma suffered by my son and I, so that it does not flare up in the damp. I could buy equipment for homeschooling, or repair the kitchen tap, or not have to rely on hand-me-down clothes from friends and family who have already a shortened life from being worn. I could afford haircuts for all of us. Ultimately, the £20 uplift would go directly towards the health and prospects of a generation of children, my children, who have so much potential, resilience, imagination and compassion due to their circumstances and the times that we live in. And all we need to do is support their parents to get those children to a point where they can build a good life for themselves. This will not happen if, for the sake of £20, they are hungry or cold or their needs aren't met. The £20 uplift is the foundation of hope for children. Now, I want to thank Michelle for being willing to share her experience last week and agreeing to forward her words for me to read to you today. They speak of what happens to families who are not given adequate support. They speak of the difference this £20 per week could make, should make, would make to those on legacy benefits, and what will be ripped away in April for those on universal credit. What Michelle went on to say when the discussion opened up was that even if the health effects of the pandemic are back under control by the end of March, which is likely to be a stretch, the economic impact for families on low incomes like Michelle's will be felt for months, possibly years to come. She will be paying back credit and interest on credit for months, even years, because she needed to purchase the minimum required to ensure her children were able to learn at home and to pay for food and other essentials. It shows the deep holes there is in the social security safety net, both prior to and during the pandemic, that people are relying on credit cards for food, heating and clothes, basic essentials. As I've said in this chamber before, the uplift and social security rates in general should not be determined by the pandemic. It should be determined by what people need to live. The OBR expects over 800,000 people to become unemployed in the second quarter of 2021 after the job retention scheme stops again. Will living costs be any less for those households? Will it be any easier for them than it is now with the uplift in place? Absolutely not. Social security is supposed to be there for any of us when we need it, ensuring us against hard times, like the NHS when we are ill. What Michelle and millions of others are telling us is current social security levels are not adequate, not enough to stop families who need it then having to rely on credit cards to buy food, heating and clothes. And for the government to hold off any longer in taking the decision is letting down these families who have no certainty, no security and no means to plan. Instead of actually analysing the needs of recipients and permanently uprating universal credit and legacy benefits by £20 a week, the government has been flying kites about providing a one-off £500 grant, but only for some. This is about the UK government trying to do as little as they can get away with in an attempt to get through a difficult political situation today. It does not in any way replace the long-term security that the uplift provided and does nothing for those newly unemployed after the grant has been applied. Making the £20 per week uplift permanent and extending it to legacy benefits is the least they should be doing. particularly as it won't even make up for the cuts since 2010. So in conclusion, the UK government has a choice. Make the cuts to social security since 2010 a little less worse by making the uplift permanent and extending it to legacy benefits, and in turn save so many families for poverty. Or it can cut that lifeline further and make out-of-work support the least generous it has ever been and impoverish millions. It appears today that there may not even be a vote, most probably because if there was, there would be a significant rebellion from the government backbenches. So if ministers do not plan opposing this motion, they must honour it as quickly as possible. They owe it to Parliament, but most importantly, they owe it to Michelle and the millions of families like hers on universal credit and legacy benefit who need this help as soon as possible.
Thank you. The opposition wind-up will begin at 6:55 p.m. The government response at 7:05 p.m. The question put at 7:15. There is a 3-minute limit on all backbench contributions. Video link, Hugh Merriman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'm really pleased to be able to contribute in this debate. I'm particularly proud of this government's response to the pandemic, really supporting individuals and businesses. £280 billion has been pumped in to give this help, and it's been hailed by the IMF and other global authorities as being real sound support to businesses and households. So I was really disappointed to hear the opposition spokesperson describe the £20 increase in universal credit, which has been an absolute godsend to so many during the pandemic, as turning into a cut. This is not the case, and it's important that everybody outside of this place understands it. The measures we put in place have been temporary to support the individuals and the country at large during the pandemic. Once the pandemic comes to an end and we return back towards some normality, then of course the government won't be subsidising 80% of employee wages. Of course the government won't be paying businesses not to open. And in the same way, we'll go back to the same welfare support that we've always offered and have always made sure that those who deserve it get what they need to be supported. But I really want to ask the opposition spokesperson this. If it is the case that the Labour Party are going to continue this extended increase in universal credit, how is it going to be paid for? Is it going to be a 1% increase in income tax on everybody else that works? Will it be the axe to the £2 billion kickstart scheme, which will pay employers first, the employee's 6 months' salary for those between the age of 16 and 24, to really give young people a chance to get into the workplace? Will it be the end of the £3 billion restart programme, which will provide support for 1 million unemployed people to find work? Will it be the undoing of the doubling of the number of work coaches to 27,000 in our job centre pluses? That itself would cost £1 billion. That's 3 axe items that the opposition could put in to fund the £6 billion. Or will it just be chucked on top of the national debt, which was already in difficulty, but now, of course, has got out of control as a result of the pandemic? This would end up being paid for by young people who've already suffered during this pandemic. Just to chuck more debt onto those young people is completely unfair and unjust. And the opposition spokesperson had a personal plea to new Conservative MPs from previous Labour-held seats. I've got one too. Please stand firm behind this Chancellor. We've seen 200,000 fewer people in absolute poverty since 2010, 1,000 new jobs a day created, 1.2 million fewer workless households. If we turn every single temporary extension of help into a permanent, then we will not get the Treasury delivering these temporary measures that we badly need. So I support the government, support universal credit, and I very much hope the opposition back down.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The problem is that the government has lost the capacity to listen to its own backbenchers, to the All-Party Select Committee, to people claiming universal credit, and to the public. That was very clear in the contemptuous dismissal of my committee's report on the 5-week delay between applying for universal credit and receiving the first regular payment. The government response to that report was published last week. We, in our meetings, studied the evidence, we sifted the material, we listened carefully to what ministers said in response, and it is clear The 5-week delay is forcing people to food banks, it's pushing them into rent arrears. Social security is supposed to protect people from those things, not induce them, as it is at the moment. So on a unanimous, all-party basis, we recommended new starter payments, equivalent to 3 weeks' worth of standard universal credit, to tide people over those difficult first few weeks. The government's response simply dismissed that recommendation and all the recommendations. Now, of course, the government can reject our recommendations. It could carry out its own analysis and reach different conclusions. We recommended that the department should do its own research on the impact of the 5-week wait on food bank demand, on rent arrears, and on claimants' mental health. The response, I quote, "The department will not be conducting or commissioning any research." That was it. It doesn't want to know. It's lost the capacity to listen. And now, how can it be right that people have to wait until March to find out whether universal credit will be cut by almost a quarter at the end of March? How are struggling families supposed to plan? And what justification can there be for having left job seekers allowance and employment and support allowance unchanged? Those claiming them are in exactly the same position as people claiming universal credit. People receiving the severe disability premium haven't been allowed to switch to universal credit, even if they wanted to. Why have ministers singled out disabled people for such harshness? If the cut goes ahead, it'll push child poverty up to levels we haven't seen since 1997. There's no justification for going back to £72 per week. One very telling point, Mr Deputy Speaker, in the briefing circulated by the British Association of Social Workers, the sharp increase in children in care, up from 60,000 to 80,000, with the enormous cost that imposes, began when the cuts to benefits began. It is a false economy. The £20 a week should be left in place.
Video link. Stephen Crabb.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I think the performance of universal credit during this crisis has been one of the truly standout successful parts of the government's response to the pandemic. The fact that our welfare system didn't topple over in the way some had predicted is to the enormous credit of the whole DWP organisation, not least the Minister who speaks from the front bench today. And when it comes to the totality of our financial response to COVID-19, I would challenge anyone to point to another country where there has been such an extensive range of support to protect families' incomes. The measures that the Chancellor has put in place are historic and they are effective. The evidence shows that they've reduced the impact of the crisis on those with lowest incomes, with the poorest working households protected the most. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, I appreciate the kind of extra spending we've seen in the last year is beyond the capability of almost any government to lock in permanently. But the question for us right now is whether the end of March this year, just 10 weeks away, is the right moment to begin unwinding this support, specifically to remove the extra support for universal credit claimants. And I don't believe it is the right moment. I've been clear about the importance of the £20 per week uplift in supporting family incomes right at the bottom of the income scale. It's made an enormous difference to those who've lost their jobs, sadly, during this crisis, but also to all of those on the lowest wages who've carried on working throughout the pandemic. We forget that more than a third of all universal credit claimants are working. They are the workers we support. And the truth is that the labour market is a horrible place right now for many people. Opportunities for people to find new work, to increase their hours, boost their earnings, improve their family finances have been massively curtailed by the economic impact of the public health emergency. And that's the context for this discussion about cutting back the £20 per week uplift. It's why I believe the uplift is so important right now, and it's why I believe it needs to be extended for the further 12 months. Now, I'm not blind to the public expenditure pressures facing the Chancellor. I have no qualms about going out and defending very difficult decisions when they're based on a clear plan with clear justifications. But the truth is, I don't believe we have such a plan right now. There is no decision yet, even with the proposed change being less than 12 weeks away. I believe that people need some certainty about their family finances for the coming year. And so, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I do find myself in agreement with the motion before the House tonight. So to conclude, I do want to see the Chancellor commit to a further extension to the uplift to 12 months to enable us to put the pandemic well and truly behind us, provide an opportunity for economic activity to pick up and for labour market opportunities to improve. And I hope that the Chancellor and the Prime Minister are listening.
Video link. Kate Osamore.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I speak in support of the motion. My constituents in Edmonton have felt the impact of the pandemic particularly harshly. Not only have we seen some of the highest rates of infection in the country, but the unemployment rate has shot up almost 12%, double the national average. As of last August, 16,000 households in Edmonton relied on universal credit, and another 11,000 households remained on legacy benefits like ESA. Those 11,000 households have been ignored by the government and received no £20 uplift. The government must reconsider that arbitrary decision. Mr. Deputy Speaker, every week I hear from constituents who are struggling to get by, even with the uplift. £20 may mean nothing to the Cabinet and to the Prime Minister, who complained he cannot afford to live on a salary of £160,000 a year. But for thousands of families across the country, £20 a week is the only thing that stands between them and a food bank, being able to pay the rent or heat their home. One of those people is my constituent, Sarah, who claims universal credit and has a 7-year-old child. Universal credit only just covers Sarah's rent and bills. If this cut goes ahead, Sarah will have to choose between falling behind her rent or staying warm, a choice no one should have to make. That is why it's important to understand the uplift in context. The uplift barely made a dent in cuts to benefits the government has made over 10 years, the last 10 years. Even with the £20 uplift, UK unemployment and in-work benefits rank as some of the least generous in Europe. Only last week, the Prime Minister was asked by the Honourable Member for East Ham about the £20 cut. And in response, he said he wanted to focus on jobs and not welfare. Can you imagine how my constituents felt hearing such a callous reply? This is not a choice between helping people in work or helping the unemployed, because people both in and out of work claim universal credit. Many are in low-paid work or may be unable to work due to illness or disability. This motion argues for a change in priorities. By making this reckless cuts to universal credit, the government will be taking money out of the pockets of people who need us the most during the biggest recession for hundreds of years. I asked the Minister to cancel the cuts and apply the £20 uplift to the thousands of people in receipt of legacy benefits. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
And apologies for the slight delay in the audio over the video, but we heard everything that Kate had to say. Video link, Simon Fell.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'm proud of the incredible package of support that's been put forward by the government to assist families and those struggling during these times. It's been as unprecedented in its scope and reach as this pandemic has been challenging. Over £280 billion has been brought forward to support people's jobs and incomes through this emergency, a package praised by the IMF as one of the best examples of coordinated action globally. And that support includes the topic of today's debate, the uplift in universal credit that amounts to £1,000 extra a year. Now, my views on this are on the record. I'm glad to stand with my colleagues in the Northern Research Group when we say that now is not the time to consider any reduction in the uplift in universal credit. This uplift was brought in to help people through the extreme challenges of the pandemic, and those challenges haven't passed. Indeed, as furlough ends, we may be entering even more challenging times. More and more people have been pushed into the category of just about managing. More and more people are now using universal credit than ever before. And indeed, the system and its flexibility is the unsung hero of these times, providing a safety blanket for so many. The uplift isn't a handout, but rather a genuine hand up to those who need it and are trying to do the right thing. Alongside the rest of the support package offered by this government, it's been compassionately delivered in the face of an incredibly challenging backdrop. And we've got to recognise why we're here. This pandemic has fundamentally shaken society and given us reason to look again at ourselves and how we help our neighbours. The community response to COVID has been remarkable. In my own constituency, the energy and dedication of local community resilience groups is something to behold. We see that same energy again in the volunteers, doctors and staff who are supporting the vaccination effort. But for all that, the virus risks taking communities like mine backwards. We simply can't allow the impacts of it to stretch beyond health and entrench disadvantage as well. This is even more the case as we look to recovery and levelling up post-pandemic. It's absolutely right that decisions on spending are taken at the budget. This is the normal and appropriate way of doing things. But I gently ask my honourable and right honourable friends to consider these views carefully. The uplift is making all the difference. Yesterday, I received an email from a constituent who'd never used universal credit before and told me that she'd never expected to, but she called it life-saving. This government has done so much to support families through this crisis, but we should remember that phrase, Mr. Deputy Speaker. We should be unafraid at the budget of maintaining the uplift whilst the effect of this pandemic is still being felt. Doing so would be in keeping with the agile and comprehensive support the government has delivered to families since the start of this pandemic.
Neil Coyle.
Mr. Speaker. Today is Blue Monday, when people feel at their lowest ebb, and the actions of this true blue government will add to that despair. A government elected on a promise to level up, but cutting help at a crucial time in the middle of a pandemic with rising unemployment and restrictions not yet lifted. People worried about their finances and pushed to the edge by COVID will see how much the Tories really care today in the way they hold this debate and in their denial about wider universal credit problems. This is a system that has been running 8 years. It costs more than the legacy system and actually helps fewer people. A third of applicants last year got nothing, turned away at the point of need. It has caused food bank use to rise dramatically, and food banks tell me that the last thing people require in their support need is a cut from government now. Last year, more than 300,000 people got their first payment late. That figure will be substantially higher this year, according to the government's own figures. And this is a government which the UN has shown has created a system which requires people to experience poverty, much through inbuilt delays to payments. And delays are not free. Rent does not stop. The need to eat does not stop. The government's solution for the people facing those delays is debt. Last year, 500,000 people seeking help were told they could only have a loan, with the Universal Credit Debt to the Department for Work and Pensions reaching £1 billion. And extra funds are available to fix it, to help if the government fixes problems. The NAO showed that more than £1 in every 10 spent on universal credit is erroneous one way or another. The government has not done enough to fix that problem. In Sunak, a third of the people on universal credit are in work, and people I've seen include a woman whose entire first monthly payment of universal credit was £17.68. And I've been helping a man whose combination of furlough and universal credit doesn't even cover his rent and bills. These are people required to use a food bank from my constituency office at the heart of central London. And the Tory response to these circumstances is to cut help. It's extraordinary, but we see their true blue values in the wider debate about tackling poverty. Values that lead to the member for Mansfield's ludicrous insinuation that government food vouchers were being used in crack houses and brothels, or his Tory colleague in Redcar suggesting their use for alcohol when they simply cannot be. More than 9,000 people in Redcar are on universal credit and deserve better representation, and by contrast, their former MP has been working in a food bank and setting up a book bank to help local children. Then, of course, there's the Leader of the House, who attacked UNICEF and charities helping children in Southwark. The fact that UNICEF and the UN are trying to highlight and alleviate poverty in Britain should shame our government and secure action. Instead, they attack the messenger. They pretend their system is working when it is failing people, even with the uplift. They pretend that Labour would scrap the lot, putting out trash information as the truth is too painful for them to admit. And they pretend to care, or they'd be hammering on the minister's door and demanding an extension of help and not a cut today.
Video link.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the member for Bermondsey and Old Southwark in this debate. As a new MP, I've been fascinated by the business and workings of this House and how opposition debates operate in attempts to further the political aims of the opposition. These debates can certainly be passionate and emotive. The opposition contributions do at times seem to lack a grounding in reality and tend to whip up anxiety and despondency. I prefer instead to look at the details and facts. The evidence shows that the government's measures so far through the pandemic have been truly groundbreaking. The range of measures are worth over 208 schools and vulnerable children. A 500
Sarah, stop there. Start again at the sentence you just began, because we're going to do this with audio.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's great being a UMP and to see the vacancies of how this system works. It's a pleasure to follow my friend.
Sarah, we really can't hear you. What we're going to do is go to James Murray next, please, and then we're going to try and get you back on when we know that we've got a much better link. Let's go to James Murray, please.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, our country went into 2021 with soaring rates of COVID infection, the greatest excess death rate in Europe, and having had the worst recession of any major economy. Whatever happens with the vaccination programme, we face many more months of restrictions and economic impacts that will be felt for years to come. And yet, the Chancellor and the government cannot see how wrong it is to take away £20 a week from families who, having been hit by 10 years of cuts to social security and incomes, are now struggling with the extra costs of food and bills in the middle of the worst economic crisis in 300 years. It is a disgrace that today's debate is even necessary. This cut to universal credit will hit millions of the poorest families in the country. In my constituency in West London, 44% of children are living in poverty. This cut will hit thousands of families in Ealing North, where over 4,300 households with children received universal credit in August last year, up by more than 1,800 since the start of last year. The mother of one of these families, Claire, wrote to me on Friday night about today's debate. Claire kindly agreed I can read a few sentences from her email in which she explained, "The £20 weekly boost is such a lifeline for us, especially for my family. I am a single parent and have an autistic son who is extremely vulnerable. I also have severe COPD, and this extra amount has allowed us to buy some good reading books and nice food, which we could not afford without the £20 boost. My son needs constant care, and just for him to have some books gives me some free time to relax and to have some time to catch up on chores and also my sleep, as my son only sleeps 4 hours maximum at night. I've also been able to bake some nice meals that are nutritious, where I could not afford most of the ingredients before the extra was in place. Families like Claire's and others across the country need that extra help. The government must cancel this cut, extend the uplift across legacy benefits, and show they understand the impact their approach to social security has on people's lives. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the outbreak has confirmed how inadequate our social security system has become and how challenging it is for so many people to get by one week to the next. The fact the government felt it had to increase universal credit by £20 a week at the outset of the COVID crisis shows how insufficient it already was. And beyond the outbreak, we are clear the system should be replaced with one that offers a proper safety net and decent support for all. Cancelling the £20 cut to universal credit will not right all that is wrong, but it will be a lifeline for millions as we come through this crisis.
Thank you, James. We're now going to go back to Sarah. I think we've got an audio link. And Sarah, you've got the full 3 minutes, so start right from the very beginning. Sarah Dines.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's nice to be able to get through at last. As a new MP, I've been fascinated by the business and workings of this House and how opposition debates operate in attempts to further the political aims of the opposition. These debates can certainly be passionate and emotive. The opposition contributions do at times seem to lack a grounding in reality and tend to whip up anxiety and despondency. I prefer instead to look at the details and facts behind these debates. The evidence undoubtedly shows that the government's measures so far through the pandemic have been truly groundbreaking. The range of measures are worth over 280 billion, including 6 billion in increases to welfare. In addition, there was 1 billion in catch-up funding for schools and vulnerable children, a 500 million hardship fund, and 170 million to support food poverty this winter. It is simply untrue to characterise this government, as this motion attempts to do so, as uncaring and as trying to plan cats, as the motion says. As a Conservative, I believe the way out of poverty is through work, and this government has supported this and gone further than any government with the 30 billion plan for jobs. No past Labour government can compare to this. Poverty is complex and multifaceted. It is not simply about welfare spending, it's about attainment, opportunities, addiction, social capital and mental health. The Labour Party look to an ever-increasing welfare state. I do not. I look towards supporting people to be free from the state, to work for themselves and to be supported and to be caught by a safety net when needed. This is precisely what this government has done. They have supported the poorest households the most, and I'm very proud of that. They have reduced the impact of the crisis on income losses by up to 2/3. This is a fantastic achievement. The temporary and emergency uplift in universal credit of £1,000 a year will be considered by the government, and the next steps will be set out fully in the budget on the 3rd of March 2021. To say anything different is opportunist. In Derbyshire Dales, many have impressed upon me that the government's support during this pandemic has been impressive. This government has gone further than any peacetime Labour government. I certainly will not be voting for this opposition motion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Sarah. We may not have been able to see you, but we heard you loud and clear. Video link, Ruth Edwards.
10 months ago, Mr. Deputy Speakers, the shutters came down on businesses across our economy. People's whole way of life changed overnight. The impact was unprecedented. In answer, we needed an unprecedented response, and this government delivered. As my honourable friends have said, through a £280 billion support package. Support that helped businesses across the country survive and save jobs through grants, the furlough scheme, the self-employed income support scheme, and government-backed business loans. Support that helped families pay their bills and put food on the table through the Council Tax Hardship Fund, the COVID Winter Grant Scheme, increasing Healthy Start payments, and establishing a £220 million holiday activities and food programme. Support that gave people security over the future of their home through a 6-month mortgage holiday and a temporary ban on eviction for renters. The government's response has been praised by international bodies such as the IMF as one of the best support packages in the world. But even this has not been able to save every job. So we invested billions to help people get back into work through apprenticeships, the Kickstart scheme, and one-to-one coaching. We have doubled the number of work coaches and injected billions of pounds into the welfare system, boosting universal credit and working tax credit by £1,000 per year for 12 months. Now, the leader of the opposition says he wants to scrap universal credit, yet today his party is here arguing to keep this temporary increase. Surely, Mr. Deputy Speaker, it can't be both. Their proposal today would cost £6 billion per year. How would they pay for it? Would they increase income tax by 1% for 30 million taxpayers and put a 5p increase in fuel duty? Or would they increase VAT to at least 21%? Or would they raid one of our job creation schemes or existing support packages? Or one of the new commitments we'd already made? Commitments to increase the national living wage worth £345 a year for someone working full-time, to help 3.5 million families pay their council tax, to maintain the increase in the local housing allowance. These are big commitments. They're important to families up and down the country, including those who receive universal credit and working tax credits. It's right we've made these commitments and that we support people further. But how we do that should be properly considered and costed in the budget.
Video link. Mick Whitley.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. In support of the motion, the government should hang its head in shame for leaving people on universal credit living under the shadow of a potential cut in their benefits at the end of March. We face the worst recession of any European country to a large extent due to the government's shambolic handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. The Prime Minister's failure to provide a clear strategy, some economic certainty and the adequate financial support that millions of people desperately need is a failure of leadership and of government policy. The scale of this crisis is massive and growing. In my constituency of Birkenhead, I represent two of the most deprived council wards in the country. Over 12,000 of my constituents claim universal credit, a 51% increase since the pandemic began. Countless others are also in receipt of legacy benefits. And joblessness continues to soar. Every day, more people join the ranks of the unemployed. Even those who have kept their jobs are struggling to make ends meet. Furloughed workers are now forced to survive without a fifth of their pay packets each month. My resolve on this issue has been strengthened by the deluge of messages from my constituents. The £20 uplift is a vital lifeline, as crucial to people's financial health as the vaccine is to their physical health. So many constituents have told me of their fear and despair for their very survival it is taken from them. But still, the government has refused to make the uplift to universal credits and working tax credit permanent, or confirm that it will be extended beyond April 2021. At the same time, I believe that those excluded from the original uplift, those on legacy benefits, should also get a £20 a week rise. Let me be clear, if during the work economic crisis in living memory, the government goes ahead and cuts £20, that has enabled so many people to get by, it will be an absolute scandal. The Resolution Foundation estimates that if this cut goes ahead, the bottom fifth of earners will lose 7% of their income. Similarly, Citizens Advice predicts that 75% of the people they help with debt issues will not be able to cover basic costs if the uplift is cut. It will mean more children going hungry, more families being unable to heat and light their homes, and more households facing the threat of eviction. It would mean human suffering on an epic scale in Birkenhead and across the country. And by doing away with the uplift, the government would take away over £12 million from Birkenhead's economy, with cash-strapped families spending less in our local supermarkets and independent stores. Build back better, a hollow phrase masking economic vandalism. We must not let this government pave the way to a new pandemic where poverty becomes the next deadly virus. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Thank you, Mick. Video link, Julie Marson.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm proud to state clearly once more that the support this government has provided to people and businesses during the pandemic has been unparalleled and unprecedented, and is one of the most comprehensive packages of support provided by any government anywhere in the world. With £280 billion committed in support for jobs and incomes, the emergency response has included the furlough scheme, government-backed loans, support for the self-employed, mortgage holidays, protection for renters, support for people with housing costs, a £500 million council tax hardship fund. We extended the energy price cap, provided £750 million package to support charities, £1 billion in catch-up funding for schools and vulnerable children. It's increased the living wage, raised the national insurance threshold to boost pay. And of course, the government has provided a £7 billion injection into the welfare system to support millions of households. We are the party of jobs and job creation. We know that work is the best route to recovery, and we've put in place a £30 billion transformative plan for jobs to create jobs and enhance skills, because we know that work, not welfare, is the route to recovery and out of poverty. The Chancellor will make his economic announcements, including those involving universal credit, at the budget in March, and that is entirely right and proper. Long-term decisions of this nature have to be taken in the context of a range of economic levers and situations, and of course in the context of paying for them. And as this is an Opposition Day debate, Mr. Deputy Speaker, let's reflect just for a moment on an opposition which wants to abolish the universal credit system, without which our welfare system would have collapsed, let alone cope with 1 million more applicants. They once told us they'd abolish boom and bust and opposed every measure to get the nation's finances back on a sound footing after the financial crisis. And let's not forget that it was only a little over a year ago that they were campaigning to make Jeremy Corbyn our Prime Minister and John McDonnell our Chancellor. Mr. Speaker, there's no legislative impact from today's vote, and it has no bearing on policy or decision making. What my constituents need is a government which will deliver real support and real change. And that's what this government is doing. And that's what we will set out at the budget in March.
Thank you. Just a gentle reminder, please don't refer to current members of Parliament by their names, please. Video link, Howell Williams.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. We in Plaid Cymru have called consistently for the addition to universal credits to be made permanent and for it to be extended to legacy benefits. This is the bare minimum social security response required with so many people experiencing such hardship. Millions of people in Wales and across the UK are facing many more months of want, with no guarantee that the pandemic will be over by March, when this artificial deadline is to be imposed. Now, the Minister said he can't predict the circumstances in April, neither can I. That is exactly why the certainty of the uplift should be continued. It's no surprise that the government wants to dodge yet another U-turn, having been forced to extend school meals after the swindle of food hampers for hungry kids and all the rest of it. But for the government to cut this vital support that universal credit provides just in order to save face would be morally reprehensible. The Secretary of State should have the courage to say, the facts have changed, I have changed my mind. If this cut goes through, over a third of Welsh households will be more than £1,000 a year worth off. This month, the figure on universal credit in Arfon is up again at just shy of about 5,000. So less money for children in Arfon, less for the basics of food, of heating and of clothing, piling further deprivation onto children already disadvantaged, possibly for life, by the disruption to their education. And this when in Wales, even before COVID-19, nearly a quarter of people living in the country were in poverty, rising shamefully to 3 in 10 children. This government intends social security spending in Wales to be cut by around £250 million, less for Welsh parents to spend, but also £250 million taken out of the Welsh economy, less for local businesses already reeling from COVID. It would be indefensible for the Westminster government to harm the children of Wales like this at the best of times, doing so during the worst pandemic in memory, and that after a decade of vicious austerity is unforgivable. To lift Wales out of poverty, we urgently need the power to restore the deep cracks in our welfare system caused by years of both blue and red austerity. This deliberate cut and all the other welfare failures over decades are further proof that Westminster is not up to the job. We in Wales urgently need full powers over welfare to be devolved to our Senedd. Thank you.
Thank you, Howell. Video link, Gagan Mahindra.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I first congratulate the Minister for Welfare Delivery for his opening statement and the work that him and his department have done in making sure that our most vulnerable have the safety net that universal credit provides. Can I also take this opportunity to thank or congratulate and give credit to my right honourable friend, the Member of Parliament for Chingford and Woodford Green, who pioneered universal credit. I think it's worth repeating how the Minister said that if we had relied on the old system, the likelihood would have been that the system would have fallen over during this global pandemic. So credit needs to be recognised. Following on from that theme, if we look back to March, when the Chancellor was so proactive and reactive to the global pandemic to ensure that our residents and our constituents had the support that was necessary, this was in unprecedented times, and I congratulate the Chancellor on that. Within my own constituency of South West Hertfordshire, I've got about 2,800 people reliant on universal credit. That's more than doubled than pre-COVID times. But the universal credit uplift and the temporary uplift was there for as part of the armoury of support that this government has given. One point that I really did want to stress to the House, Deputy Speaker, was language is really important. If we, as a government and policymakers, introduce things temporarily, but there's an expectation that it'll be permanent, that will have significant impact on finances. I think the budget in just over 6 weeks' time is absolutely the right time to be having this conversation. You cannot look at policy making on a standalone piecemeal basis that this opposition motion is proposing. The £280 billion of measures that have been introduced since the start of the pandemic is unprecedented. And one thing that really does worry me is how we are going to look to afford this. I think it's worth reiterating that we as politicians and members of this House are purely custodians of other people's money, i.e. taxpayers. We need to remain pragmatic, and the continued economic uncertainty does mean that actually leaving these decisions to the 3rd of March is appropriate. I will leave it at that, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I look forward to the rest of the debate.
Video link. Debbie Abrahams.
Universal credit has significant design flaws going back to its inception in 2012, but added to in 2015 by drastic cuts in social security spending. This meant that at the beginning of the pandemic last year, approximately £33 billion had already been cut in support for working age people, with single parents and disabled people particularly affected. Universal claimants have been driven into debt, rent arrears, and the increase in food bank demand is attributed to UC's introduction. The associated poverty is driving negative impacts on health. For example, a peer review report published in The Lancet last March showed people who moved onto universal credit experienced clinically significant psychological distress as a result. Another report from the BMJ showed that the hostile and demeaning universal credit system worsened physical and mental health. As the COVID crisis hit, not everyone could work from home, and it was the low-paid and vulnerable sectors such as hospitality and leisure who've been the most affected, driving the increase in UC claimants. We know that not only is this health crisis far from over, but neither are the impacts on the economy and jobs. People need reassurance that in their time of need, an adequate safety net is there. In my Oldham East and Saddleworth constituency, more than half of the 14,633 claimants are now claiming UC as a result of the pandemic. Many have contacted me about the debate, but it wasn't just those relying on UC who've written to me, reflecting the recent poll that showed 74% of the public support the increase in UC and want to see it extended. As chair of the UC APPG, we held an inquiry into the impact of COVID on claimants last spring and made a number of recommendations to the Chancellor last November, including retaining the £20 per week uplift, but also extending it to legacy benefits and also replacing the 5-week wait with initial non-repayable starter payment. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we know from the Save the Children that there's a potential increase in 200,000 children who are going to be living in poverty if this uplift isn't extended. The Resolution Foundation have estimated that by 2024, there will be an additional 730,000 children living in poverty. But even if this uplift continues, people are still struggling. We know that 1 in 5 on UC always run out of money compared with 8% not reliant on UC. We know that 500,000 people have accrued rent arrears since the start of the pandemic with an average of £730 debt. And of course, the ban on evictions also runs out at the end of March. Mr. Deputy Speaker, COVID saw those already struggling to stay afloat bear the brunt of the economic and the health burden. We must not let them down. We must extend the UC uplift. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Debbie. Video link. Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to speak in this debate, and I want to thank my honourable friend, the member for Stalybridge and Hyde, for the way he set out the case from the front bench. The facts speak for themselves. In my own constituency, 9,147 of the lowest paid people across Audenshaw, Denton, Dukinfield, Reddish and the Heatons will be affected. People who are struggling and many who are relying on this money to get them through the current crisis. The Trussell Trust has said that cutting universal credit could increase already high food bank use by another 10%. Just let that figure sink in. Universal credit is an in-work benefit too, replacing the previous working and child tax credits. In that context, it is unthinkable to take £20 a week or £1,000 a year away from families. The Resolution Foundation says this cut would see the poorest households lose 7% of disposable income. Child Poverty Action Group states the £20 uplift is essential to ensure low-income families with the children receive the support that they need. And last September, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation said the cut risked bringing 700,000 more people, including 300,000 more children, into poverty. These are just staggering and frankly frightening figures that should shame us all. We are better than this. Urge the Chancellor to stop this cut, to support those in need. Now, I know this is a motion brought to the House by the Labour opposition, and politics dictates that we should take partisan lines. I get those are the rules of the game, having been an MP for almost 16 years, and I've seen it time and again. But this isn't a game. It's people's lives, millions of people's lives. It's our children's future, and sometimes we need to unite across the political divide, to make a stand, to do the right thing. And this political spin that by abstaining tonight it deprives Labour of the opportunity to incite, and I quote, hatred and bullying towards Conservative MPs is just ratcheting up that game playing. The only anger will be because this isn't a game for 6 million families, it's real life. And the best way to remove that anger is to do the right thing and vote for the motion to stop the cut. All members know this cut is wrong. 6 million families are depending on us. I know I've represented the 9,147 who will be affected by this cut in Denton and Reddish. I oppose this cut, and I will vote against it if there is a vote tonight.
Video link. Saki Bhatti.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The last 12 months have been hugely difficult for many of our constituents as COVID-19 has ravaged our communities. And I know that for those who have struggled to make ends meet, the £20 uplift has relieved pressures on household expenditure. Certainly on my side of the House, there isn't a single member who doesn't want to support their constituents throughout this difficult period. That's why I consider this motion by the Labour Party nothing more than a cynical attempt to score political points. And frankly, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we should be above this. This issue is too important. Our constituents deserve better than this. Through the course of the pandemic, we've seen the government proactively provide support to those who've needed it and when they've needed it most. Support measures are worth £280 billion, including the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme, £170 million to support food poverty over the winter period, a £500 million hardship fund, £6 billion in increases to welfare, and £670 million to help people pay their council tax bills, along with an increase of almost £1 billion last year to help to increase the local housing allowance programme, all of which have helped to make sure that there has been a degree of security for my constituents in my constituency in their most anxious moments. The fact is, the Chancellor's packages have been recognised across the world, including by organisations such as the IMF, the Bank of England and the OBR, as being world-leading and crucial to shoring up the economy and livelihoods of the worst hit by this pandemic. And it's incumbent upon all of us to consider the best path to economic recovery out of the pandemic for those who need it most. And there's no doubt in the mind of a Conservative that a healthy economy will lessen the need for universal credit in our society. A strong economy will deliver the jobs required to give people the stability and security that they need to thrive and succeed. Mr. Deputy Speaker, nobody should consider the impact of good employment on welfare to be insignificant. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the introduction of the uplift to universal credit was the right thing to do at the time, and given the economic and social situation, it was absolutely something that I support. And I commend the Chancellor for it, and my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for the Department of Work and Pensions, for making sure that universal credit has worked smoothly and supported those that have needed it most. And for those watching who are not familiar with parliamentary procedure, will see that the motions put forward today are not binding. They don't change anything. They don't protect lives, and they don't protect the poorest in our society. And if the last opposition debate is anything to go by, it'll be used by many as an excuse to abuse some of my colleagues and my friends, some with physical threats, as happened last time, to themselves and their families. And these should be condemned across the House. That's why I believe it's not right to engage in these political games by the opposition, not least because the opposition want to abolish universal credit, which would leave the future for so many uncertain and would reduce the support they have. Gotcha politics won't solve the scourge of poverty in our society. I think the Chancellor should be given the space to make the decisions that he needs to do when he presents the budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Saqib. Video link. Claire Hanna.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to our colleagues in the Labour Party for bringing forward this debate and to try to provide security and reassurance to those across all our constituencies who've relied on this uplift at a time of increased cost and fewer economic opportunities. Universal credit claimants in my constituency had increased by 145% on the year to November, which includes many of those who haven't been reached by furlough and self-employment support. The Prime Minister stated last week that what we want to see is jobs and growth. We all do, Mr. Speaker, but between COVID and Brexit, that's simply not a realistic solution at the present. Wanting a better economic climate is not going to meet the basic needs of those who are on universal credit, and it ignores the fact that 40% of claimants are already in work. The compound economic crises we're facing are driving more people to need the safety net of social security, and for public health reasons, we need more people to stay at home, but the social security net is already being found unfit for purpose. Existing cuts are already biting. Lone parents, for one, have lost around 10% of their income. One participant told the Women's Regional Consortium in Northern Ireland that the amount allocated to us just isn't sufficient for basic living costs. We can't have the heating on because we can't afford the gas. Thank God for food banks, otherwise eating would have been much worse. And Mr. Speaker, I'd like to take the opportunity to recognise the work of the South Belfast Food Bank and the churches and the sporting organisations, including Breda GAA, Rosario Football Club and Ormo Boxing Club, who've come together to meet the need in this constituency. Unfortunately, in 2015, Northern Ireland returned welfare powers to Northern Ireland, and I regret that despite pledges, hundreds of people are subject to budget cuts, benefit cuts without mitigation, and I am urging the Department for Communities to bring forward legislation to stop tens of thousands more people falling into that gap, and indeed to provide top-up payment for the two-child tax credit rule. Medical experts are making clear, Mr. Speaker, that the crisis is not going to end neatly at the end of March. The economy will likely be experiencing disruption throughout 2021. The uplift was the right thing for the government to do, and I commend them for doing it, but by their own logic, there is no case for removing it now. That this change would save a lot of money is not in doubt, and I know there is consequences to borrowing, but there are consequences for the economy too. The evidence shows that universal credit is spent almost immediately, and therefore this cut would be a loss to local shops precisely when they need it most as well. To finish, Mr. Speaker, I'll borrow a phrase from Marcus Rashford: people in poverty matter, and those people the Chancellor will seriously misjudge if he thinks he can mislead people into thinking that an upfront payment is better simply than nothing. The one-off payment is an attempt to solve a political problem, but it does absolutely nothing to solve the problems of those families relying on this uplift.
Laura Trott.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And I'm grateful to the opposition for bringing forward this debate today, because it gives us an opportunity on these benches to talk about the wide-ranging and comprehensive support that we provided to the lowest income and most vulnerable families in this country. Not just through the £20 universal credit uplift, but also through the furlough scheme, which we know is critical to keeping that vital link to work, which is the sustainable route out of poverty, but also through the hardship fund, through the winter support grant and through the catch-up schemes. And not only has this support been provided to the families who most need it, but it's been done in a timely fashion. It is worth dwelling on the matters that have been raised by the Minister and others in this debate, that at points during this crisis, we had 100,000 people a day applying for universal credit. And yet, 9 out of 10 of those applications were paid on time, a fact that I hope to see recognised by more on the opposition benches. In this context, it is inexplicable that we would seek now to scrap universal credit, and it is worth dwelling for a second on what we inherited from the last Labour government. And it can be summed up in 2 simple words: a welfare trap. A situation where you had a welfare system which was inexplicable in terms of how it worked between 6 interacting benefits. It was a situation whereby if you went into work, you would actually lose money. There was an effective tax rate of 90%. Of course.
I'm grateful to you for raising that. I actually think that the politics of the taper rate in any welfare system is one of the fundamental points. Under universal credit, the taper rate is now 63%, but that doesn't account for income tax, for national insurance. So effectively, the withdrawal rate is 75 pence in the pound. Now, what she just said isn't actually the full picture. Universal credit, according to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, it does reduce the deduction rate of over 80% for some families, but it increases the deduction rate for some families. There are more families facing a deduction rate between 60 and 80% than before. So it's more complicated. It depends on the hours you work, whether you rent, what those circumstances are. But to put it in very binary terms, I'm afraid that isn't the correct position, and we should look at the detail of this, because that's what the debate deserves.
The Honourable Gentleman is quite right that there is a debate to be had over the taper rate and the right level of the taper rate, but I think we can all agree that it is better that people want to earn more from going out to work, and that the situation before was worse than the situation now. So that we've moved forward. There's always more progress to be made, but I think it's important that we make progress. So it is, in terms of the new system, I think it is better than the last. We have a situation where you have a welfare system now where it pays, in the most part, to go out to work. And that what we are trying to do is provide a safety net and not a trap, which is the difference between what we have previously. Now, in terms of the debate today, it is a complex question, and the Honourable Gentleman and members opposite will know that getting people out of poverty is more complicated than just giving people money. It is a necessary condition, but is not sufficient in and of itself. We need a situation whereby we're providing retraining, we're providing help to people get into work, we are providing support for the whole family, the numerous challenges that may face them. So it is absolutely right that this decision is taken in the round at a fiscal event where we can think about how we look at all these things, and crucially, how we do pay for them. When the opposition talked earlier about the fact that this is not the time to think about fiscal events, of course, we have shown that we will throw the kitchen sink at protecting the most vulnerable during this crisis. But that does not mean that we can make uncosted spending pledges. And we need to think very, very carefully about how we deploy our money versus everything else. This is not to say that it shouldn't take place, but it is just to say that this should be thought about in the context of our wider spending pledges and making sure that we are targeting support at the most vulnerable in society, which I'm very glad at the outset we all recognise on whatever bench we're in, that is that we are all here to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Video link. Imran Hussain.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. For many families across my constituency who have seen their jobs lost, their incomes fall and their costs rise, the increase to universal credit has been a lifeline throughout this crisis. It has kept them from being dragged into poverty, and it has prevented them from joining the thousands of others across Bradford who, because of low pay, insecure work, high costs and underemployment, sadly struggle to get from one day to the next. Yet, despite the benefits that even just this small increase has had, with families no longer having to worry as much about whether they can put food on the table, can heat their homes or keep a roof over their head, the government are still intent on cutting universal credit from April. Representing a constituency where half of children are growing up in deprivation, I know just how destructive poverty can be for families and our children's chances. It hurts their education and their development, and it actively harms both their mental and physical health. And I cannot be clearer about just how damaging pulling this small but steady foothold, which has granted much needed financial breathing space, would be for 13,000 households in my constituency on universal credit. It would cripple household finances that have already been stretched to breaking point, and it would plunge hundreds of families in Bradford into a state of poverty where they simply do not know how they will make their incomes last the week. During what is the worst recession in 300 years, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that has seen many more families who would never have expected to find themselves relying on universal credit, now dependent on the government to get by, these families need security in their incomes. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I have seen an extension of this uplift described as a splurge, as a stunt, and as a waste. But let me be clear, ensuring that people can afford to eat, can keep a roof over their head and can heat their homes is never a splurge. It is never a stunt, and it is never, ever a waste. It is a basic duty of any good government to look after the poorest and the most vulnerable in society. Yet the decision to cut universal credit just shows how far removed from this duty this government have become, and it shows how they still have not grasped that it is the lowest paid and the poorest who are being hit hardest by the coronavirus pandemic. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we cannot escape the fact that there are many flaws with universal credit, but the choice for the government today is clear. Either they vote for this Labour motion and provide low-income families with certainty and security, or they choose to write off another generation and consign yet more families and children to a life of poverty and deprivation.
Video link. Faye Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I first want to thank the staff at the Department for Work and Pensions for the way in which universal credit has stood up to the pressure of the coronavirus pandemic. In the last year, UC has supported over 5 million households, a level of demand which would have crippled the former legacy benefit system. An agile, targeted welfare system is of immense value to society, particularly to the 3,000 families in Brecon and Radnorshire who currently depend on universal credit. And so I firmly reject the comments of the Leader of the Opposition, who seeks to scrap universal credit altogether. Now more than ever, it is needed to support those who have been hardest hit by the pandemic. The International Monetary Fund has commended the UK government for its aggressive economic response to the pandemic and calls it one of the best examples of coordinated action globally. Over 280 billion has been provided to safeguard jobs and incomes through measures like the furlough scheme, the self-employed income support scheme, and bounce back loans. But as the numbers of vaccinations increase, the fight against coronavirus will move to an economic front. There is no question that we have a moral responsibility to ensure that the safety net is as strong as possible. But we cannot be ignorant to the cost to the taxpayer. Maintaining the £20 uplift will require a significant tax hike, costing around £175 a year for anyone earning £30,000 and an extra 5p per litre of fuel for every driver. Rather than just giving people money, universal credit is just one of the tools to lift families out of poverty for good. I am proud that this government is putting its shoulder into schemes like Kickstart and Restart and doubling the number of work coaches to give people intensive support to get back to the workplace. This is how you tackle poverty and how you eradicate it for good. Mr. Deputy Speaker, it is a sorry situation that during the middle of a pandemic, the Labour Party chooses to use its time to sow uncertainty and confusion. Constituents have already been in touch with me to ask if tonight's vote will reduce the money they are expecting to receive this week. I want to be very clear that it does not. Playing on the fears of those it seeks to represent is something of which the opposition should be thoroughly ashamed. I will take no lessons from the Labour Party on poverty. According to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, even before the pandemic, 1 in 4 people in Wales live in poverty. This includes 140,000 children. For 21 years, Welsh Labour has run Wales, and still, in the words of the First Minister himself, we are older, poorer and sicker. I will take no lessons from the Labour Party on poverty, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Thank you.
Video link. Alison McGovern.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, thank you. The best reason to shut down food banks that I ever heard was told to me by a woman who ended up starting her own food cooperative. As a mum of 4, following the Osborne benefit cuts, money was just too tight. She just couldn't do it. So she was advised to go to the local food bank. But when she got there, she sat outside and cried. She couldn't go in. She just couldn't do it. That's why no one in our country should have to beg for food. No one. This is why we've had the public outrage about child food hunger during this crisis. It is wrong. However, this debate today is not about Marcus Rashford's child food poverty campaign. It's not about scrappy food parcels or whether or not a child ought to be able to survive for 2 weeks on dry pasta and a loaf of white bread. This debate today is the result of what happens if you ask yourself why that campaign exists at all. This debate is the result of daring to ask the bigger question: why do we have food banks in our country? Ask yourself what the cause of poverty is, and you reach the following conclusion: too many people have jobs that pay too little, or for family reasons cannot work enough to pay for the necessities of life. This trend has been exacerbated greatly by the COVID-19 pandemic, but it was a trend set from 2010 onwards. Rising self-employment with uncertain and often low income has undermined our battle against low pay. COVID has made this 100 times worse. And many of those facing poverty are families with only one wage coming in or where disability affects work prospects. That's why the social security system needs to support them and make sure the indignity of food banks is no more. So what is the truth about social security today, and why does it fail to protect? Child benefit, the most dependable, easy to process family support, was cut in real terms by 22% from 2010 to the end of the decade. Proportionally, that was the largest welfare cut of all on our children. That means that all families with children have been squeezed for a decade. For those in low paid work, the consequences have been severe, as we have heard from other members. That's why we should welcome the extra money for families in this crisis. It went some way to address the problems created over the past 10 years. I want the government to go much further now. No third child or fourth child to be sent a message by our country that the state doesn't care about them. Every child invested in through child benefit, and never to have to see their parents in distress because of an enforced visit to a food bank. The contribution principle that Beveridge set up in our social security system is being undermined. We pay in when we're able and we take out when we need. But that promise is now being robbed from a generation. And if the minister doesn't know it, let me tell him, the anxieties we face in childhood echo on through our lives. They never leave us. That is why protecting our children is always the right thing to do.
Video link. Tom Randall.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Opposition Day debates are allocated to them by the government. And in the opposition's social media noise, they don't mention that while matters are debated and discussed on days like these, they are not decided in the same way as the ordinary legislative process. They're not backed up by white papers or detailed policy. And yet opposition relies on the public, quite understandably, not knowing the difference. After the last Opposition Day debate, my Labour predecessor dutifully posted the centrally supplied Labour attack graphics, then had to wade into the vitriolic comments under his Facebook post to ask posters to take care with their language, to which the first reply was, "Can we say scum?" asking for a friend. This is just a mild example of what happened from the last debate, a direct consequence of the efforts by the party opposite to stoke up an emotionally charged atmosphere at a difficult time. Now, I can cope with that bad language, but I know colleagues faced worse, including threats which required police intervention. So I hope the opposition will consider carefully, and I heard the opposition spokesman's comments earlier, to consider the impact of their choice of language when they present the reality of this non-binding vote. But it would be helpful if the opposition could present a motion that is consistent with their frontbench policy. Their stated aim is to abolish universal credit. And what would that achieve? Chaos. Imagine if the DWP staff, plunged into an unexpected epidemic, had been forced to try to operate a number of different benefit schemes. The welfare system would have struggled to cope. And the resilience of that system is a tribute to the sterling work of DWP staff who have faced the challenge, stepped up and met it. And I'd like to thank all the staff at the job centres that serve Gedling. I've been inspired by their enthusiasm over the last months. In the last opposition debates on free school meals, I said that while Labour might claim a moral victory, they do not address the fundamental issues which the government must now address. And very much the same applies today. This is a government that is taking action. The Hardship Fund, the COVID Winter Grant Scheme, Kickstart, Restart, millions of pounds of support for councils to help the poorest, the holiday activities and food programme, the flexible childcare fund, the furlough scheme, bounce back loans, rates relief, VAT deferrals, protection for renters, mortgage holidays, and much, much more, all supporting Gedling residents during these difficult times. While Labour plays on people's emotions, they offer no solutions. And this government is offering to support the most vulnerable in society, and I know will continue to do so at the next budget, when spending matters will quite properly be announced. So in this debate, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the division is clear, and I know which side I'm on.
Now go to Gerald Jones.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I would like to speak, albeit briefly due to time, in favour of the motion by my right honourable friend, the Leader of the Opposition, the Shadow Work and Pensions Secretary, and other honourable friends. And let me start by saying that at the very least, the government should rule out the cutting of this uplift in April and give certainty to families across the country. We know that the UK is in the midst of one of the most deadly global pandemics in a century, and we are currently at the peak of the second wave. £20 a week is making a huge difference to the 8,306 people who are in receipt of universal credit in my constituency of Merthyr Tydfil and Rumney, and the 6.2 million families across the UK. It is, in many cases, making the difference between being able to put food on the table or not. We know times are incredibly tough. Our food banks are busier than ever, trying to support as many people as they can. Here in Merthyr Tydfil and Rumney, we have a range of other voluntary organisations and community groups also offering support with meals, and it is abundantly clear that families need more support and not less, although not so clear to the government, it seems. For the government to consider this cut in the best of times would be callous, but to do it at this time, arguably the worst of times, is an absolute disgrace and plain cruel. Let us make no mistake, this cut will hit Britain's poorest households, and the government must think again. It appears, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the government is looking to make low-income families pay as a result of their incompetence and their chronic mismanagement of the pandemic that has caused Britain to suffer the worst recession of any major economy. This will make matters worse. In terms of the economy in Merthyr Tydfil and Rumney alone, this cut will mean a £7.8 million per annum loss to the local economy. We all remember, Madam Deputy Speaker, at the start of the pandemic, when the Chancellor said that the government would do whatever it takes to support people through this crisis. How hollow those words sound now. Not only have the government created the worst recession in any major economy, they are now failing to take action to stop children and families going hungry. I hope that the Minister will tell us today what it will take for the government to get real sense and stop this callous cut to the most vulnerable families in the country. Madam Deputy Speaker, we also know that since the beginning of the pandemic, the government has chosen to exclude people on so-called legacy benefits, including the disabled, sick and carers, from the extra support given to those on universal credit. The government said that it would take too much time to update the systems needed. Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, the government has had 10 months to put this right, but instead of trying to solve one problem, they're set to go headlong into creating another, affecting millions of families. And we heard examples of this from my local CAB just this morning. Madam Deputy Speaker, I urge all members right across the House, on all benches, to put the needs of the most vulnerable families in the country first and support tonight's motion. Thank you.
Now go to Suzanne Webb.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Welfare dependency is an invidious culture that I am proud that this government does not champion, nor does it aspire to. The universal credit uplift was always temporary. It was part of the generous package by this government to ensure all parts of society were supported during this pandemic. The better conversation, the better debate we should have been having today was about job creation and the government's £30 billion plan for jobs, helping people who have lost their job due to coronavirus to find new jobs, help the over 50s bounce back and quickly, helping young people into work, help people to retrain and find new well-paid jobs, giving people the security of a regular income. After all, isn't that the whole purpose of universal credit? Giving people the means and support they need to get back into work, and never more so is that important than now. This government is devoting more resources to this than any government in recent history, and I challenge anyone to say otherwise. This government has delivered £28 billion worth of support already. The furlough scheme, £1 billion in catch-up funding for schools and vulnerable children, a £500 million hardship fund, £170 million to support food poverty this winter, and over £6 billion in increases to welfare. At the beginning of this pandemic, the UK economy was in a good place, and that is why the Chancellor is right to wait for more clarity on the national economic and social picture before assessing the best way to support low-income families moving forward. They are the conversations my constituents want to hear, and not ones of political expediency or ambiguity. On one hand, the opposition calls for this debate as they think the universal credit uplift should be permanent at a cost of approximately £6 billion per year, which would mean an increase in income tax by 1% for 30 million taxpayers and a 5p increase in fuel duty. Where is the financial prudence in any of that? And bizarrely, the leader of the opposition calls to scrap universal credit, leaving people with no means of financial or practical support to get themselves back into work. Today's debate smacks of political opportunism, with straplines only serve to make the headlines and not help those most in need. Where there is no ambiguity is in the simple fact that since 2010, this country has voted in all 3 successive elections for a Conservative leadership to lead this country. And there is a reason for that. It is in this government that people entrust. And this is a time to allow this government to continue with that trust. A government that will continue to stand behind families that need our support at the time of this country's greatest need. Getting people back into work is what will see us lift this country out of this crisis, not political opportunism, not welfare dependency.
Now go to Wendy Chamberlain.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Liberal Democrats fully support the £20 uplift to universal credit and making it permanent, and we will vote later today in favour of the motion accordingly. It's the right thing to do to ensure that our most vulnerable have a safety net that works for them and their dependents. It's the right thing to do to invest in our social security system, the best way to help people escape from poverty and to help stimulate our recovery. And it's the right thing to do to act now to give families certainty rather than the approach favoured by the government, which is to leave families in the dark in the middle of the greatest economic crisis this country has ever seen. The coronavirus pandemic has transformed how so many people see our welfare system. People who never thought they would interact with the system are now doing so and need to continue doing so beyond April. So we should not be here debating about whether we should take away the vital £20. We should be debating about whether we can go further. Hundreds of thousands of people receive legacy benefits, and many of them are unable to transfer to universal credit. They were excluded last year from the Chancellor's uplift on an entirely arbitrary basis. This group includes many disabled people and their carers. How can we leave those people out of the uplift at a time which is difficult for so many? What happened to no one left behind? What happened to whatever it takes? Government has failed to act on this issue, and my North East 5 constituents who claim legacy benefits feel forgotten. And that's why we support uplifting legacy benefits and backdating that uplift to April 2020. It's the same story for carers. Unpaid carers are doing a remarkable and important job in very difficult circumstances. They deserve our support, but there is a historic deficit in the support available to unpaid carers. Carers allowance is just £67.25 a week, the lowest benefit of its kind. And that's why it's vital that the government immediately uplift carers allowance too, in line with the uplift to universal credit. Too often carers have been an afterthought for many politicians, and it's time to stand up for them. And as more and more people access universal credit, it's also high time that we looked at the areas where it is failing to deliver. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation published a report last year looking at universal credit in Glasgow. It highlighted that many people who access universal credit do suffer from mental ill health. But even more damningly, the report makes clear that even for people who didn't have a mental health condition, many still suffered anxiety caused by their engagement with universal credit. The reasons include challenges for navigating the online system and a lack of face-to-face support with this, poverty and financial insecurity due to the waiting period for the first payment, the stress of managing budgets between payments and housing, and conditionality and the fear of sanctions. The whole point of conditionality is to get people back to work. Right now, there is simply little prospect of that. The government have failed to suspend conditionality during this current lockdown, even though they suspended it between March and July last year. But I also want to highlight the digital by default approach. The majority of claimants are accessing the system on mobile technology, and these are issues for my rural constituency. In short, there is much work to be done.
We now go to Angela Richardson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As the Prime Minister has said countless times since last March, when the difficult but necessary decision was taken to fundamentally change the way we have all had to live our lives, we as a government would put our arms around the people of this country. The support has been phenomenal, not just financial, but genuine engagement across every department to support our most vulnerable. It is a proud record that we as Conservatives will stand on. The IMF has said that the UK response is one of the best examples of coordinated action globally. The key aim has always been to protect as many lives and livelihoods as possible, to give certainty in uncertain times, and even now, continued hope beyond this moment of incredible national achievement in rapidly rolling out the vaccination programme. When we emerge from this pandemic, it's important that we have not simply survived, but that we have the building blocks in place to thrive again. The Chancellor of the Exchequer will be looking at the right measures at the right time, but we are not there today. In the meantime, the extensive support has included the temporary and emergency £1,000 per year uplift to universal credit. And it is just one pillar of support, but there is much, much more. We have funded local authorities to help families of all ages in difficult circumstances with the COVID Winter Grant Scheme. Not just food vouchers, but help with bills too. Madam Deputy Speaker, it is right that we care deeply for those who struggle most, but it is also right that we are mindful of those who sit just outside the support that universal credit offers. We are asking them to support all of these measures through taxation. I look forward to hearing from the Chancellor of the Exchequer as to how he will strike this important balance in the coming weeks and months. As so many have done, I wish to recognise the excellent and professional delivery of the universal credit system overseen by my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for the Department of Work and Pensions, her team and those amazing people working in job centres. A gentle note on Opposition Day motions, if I may. Both sides of this House want what is best for every member of our communities. Making political capital and amplifying social media storms sadly comes with risk. Once, in October last year, if being generous could be deemed as unforeseen. Twice has the dishevelled appearance of carelessness. While the opposition seeks to cause division, worry and prey on the fearful, we on this side will calmly continue to deliver.
Graham Morris.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And we have before us today a simple question, a simple motion, and I'm a simple kind of guy, so I'm going to be quite straightforward in indicating that I will be supporting the motion before us. It is supported by a majority of people in this country. My union, Unite, carried out a survey indicating just that. There is, however, a wider debate to be had, not for today, but there is a wider question about values and principles. Are we as society, Madam Deputy Speaker, accepting of homeless people freezing to death on our streets? Are we a society that is accepting of millions of people being reliant on food banks for their next meal? Are we as a society prepared to accept that 1 in 3 children are receiving holiday hunger hampers in the form of food parcels? Almost 6 million families are dependent on universal credit. 40% of those are actually in work. They're in receipt of in-work benefits. Now, the government benches are accusing the opposition and we Labour MPs of being partisan, but sadly, the lives of the poorest and most vulnerable people in society only seem to concern the Conservative leadership when they risk bad headlines. Members opposite, and I include the Prime Minister, the Chancellor, the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, must know the poverty and hardship that will be caused by failing to uprate universal credit. At the outset of coronavirus, anticipating millions of new universal credit claimants, the government announced a 12-month, £20 a week uplift. This wasn't an altruistic gift, it was a political calculation. The Minister, in his opening statement, said he welcomed today's debate. Frankly, I don't expect them to change their position today. And why? It's because the government will welcome 3 months of uncertainty, of arguing against retaining the uplift. If they were to concede today, the opposition would have more time to focus on the national scandal of the government's COVID response. The government are too busy making political calculations affecting the lives of over 100,000 people in my constituency of Easington, who are in over 10,000 who are in receipt of universal credit. I expect the government will U-turn on universal credit, but it won't be today or next week. The Prime Minister should stop playing politics with people's lives and start governing in the national interest for the good of the country. U-turn today, consolidate the uplift and give some security to the millions of people who've been let down by this government.
We now go to Chris Clarkson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Yesterday, I took the unusual step of posting to my Facebook an account of what an opposition day actually is. Usually, I like to focus on local issues in Hayward and Middleton rather than process. However, after the abuse, threats and vitriol generated by the last series of opposition day debates, I felt it necessary to get ahead of the misinformation that will doubtless follow on social media after today's debate, despite the fine words from the Honourable Member for Stalybridge and Hyde. He should consider carefully the intemperate language from some of his colleagues in this debate so far. Madam Deputy Speaker, people deserve so much better than political opportunism, which is why I'm genuinely saddened by the tenor of today's debate, which is not just disingenuous, but painfully ironic. It remains the position that the official opposition want to scrap universal credit altogether. Whether it's furlough, COVID winter grants, stays on evictions, the schemes the government's put in place to support people through this pandemic have been refined and adapted to meet the changing circumstances we face, and so too with UC. Truth is, we simply don't know what the next few weeks hold or what the best fit solution will be. The responsible thing to do is to assess the situation as we approach the budget, and that's why the Secretary of State is actively reviewing next steps. Uprating UC represents £4.6 billion of additional spending to support those impacted by corona, and the rapid rollout of funds must by any measure be considered a success. Despite an almost two-thirds increase in the number of claimants, 96% of new claims got their full payment on time. Staff of the DWP deserve our thanks and praise, and I associate myself with reports from the Work and Pensions Committee and the House of Lords Economic Affairs Committee highlighting their successes and the fact that the digital structure of the benefit has enabled the system to withstand the sudden increase in demand where the legacy system would have struggled severely. Madam Deputy Speaker, we know the official opposition want to do away with UC despite its effectiveness during this national crisis, but we have yet to hear what they would do, or more importantly, where the money would come from. And that's been the hallmark of their behaviour throughout, taking no firm positions, offering no constructive alternatives. It's times like this, when we're up against it, you find out what people are really made of. I've been genuinely humbled by the selflessness of my constituents, proud of my colleagues, many of them learning the job as we deal with this pandemic, and I'm deeply saddened, but not at all surprised by the naked self-interest of members opposite in trying to weaponise this emotive subject. So, despite the earlier veiled threat to red wall Conservative MPs from the honourable gentleman opposite, I will not be voting for this motion because to do so would be to give the oxygen of publicity to an opposition who frankly have nothing constructive to say.
Sam Terry.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I find it astonishing following the honourable member for Hayward and Middleton that they do not understand on the opposite side of the House the fury that was unleashed across this country at the measures that the government is both failing to do and the way that they've treated so callously so many millions of people. Because it's clear to me and the constituents in Ilford South that really this government should be hanging its head in shame. It should not have even been forced to come to this chamber and to have this debate today. Now, this is a government that spent billions of pounds of taxpayers' money on contracts with friends that are linked with donors, hundreds of millions of pounds more on a failed test and trace system, and in my constituency, unusable PPE. And it's an absolute disgrace that they can't stump up an extra 20 quid to help put food on the table of some of those most vulnerable people in this country. Madam Deputy Speaker, we are in the midst of the worst recession ever. Millions of families, many of which are in work and rely on government support to supplement poverty wages, are on the brink. This is not a time to let them sink below the poverty line. It's a time for the government to stick its hand in its pocket and do what is right. Instead, this government's cruel and callous decision will impact more than 6 million families across this country and risk plunging more than 300,000 children into poverty. Indeed, in my own constituency of Ilford South, more than 19,000 people rely on universal credit to make ends meet. That's more than double the national average. And what's worse is that this decision comes just days after we learned the government was only setting aside £5 measly pounds to feed our children. Let's be under no illusions. This is an attack on Britain's workers by a government that represents the 1% of this country, intent on cutting tax rates for its mates while cutting handouts for the poorest. Madam Deputy Speaker, we are struggling through a devastating pandemic, and I think people on both sides of this House agree, perhaps the biggest challenge for our country since the Second World War. And due to the unprecedented nature of this crisis, we've had to all rapidly adapt. And so it's little surprise that living costs have risen in recent months. Indeed, research by Save the Children and the Joseph Rowntree Foundation found that 86% of those families with children on universal credit and tax credit have been faced with additional costs since this crisis began. The increase in government support previously was rightly welcomed and eased that burden on millions of families up and down this country. But many months, unfortunately, before we're out the other side of this awful pandemic, with millions more losing their jobs, millions more at risk of unemployment when the furlough scheme comes to its end, it's completely the wrong time to end this vital piece of support. The government has tried to spin on its one-off payment of £500 as a positive, something which so many people have seen through. As the Honourable Member for Saleybridge and Hyde has pointed out, in real terms that means the lowest level of unemployment support for 30 years, at a time when redundancies are going through the roof. Thank you very much, Madam.
I'm afraid we now have the last speaker, who is Jacob Young.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This is an unprecedented crisis that demands an unprecedented level of government support. And our Conservative government has been there for the most vulnerable at every turn. Never has any government in our history done so much to support those in need. Over £280 billion spent on measures prioritising the people on the lowest incomes. And while the Labour Party squabble over whether this should be 281 or 282 billion, our determination to help the lowest paid and most vulnerable in our society continues. In his autumn statement, the Chancellor accepted all of the recommendations of the Low Pay Commission and increased the national living wage, worth £345 for those who work a 40-hour week. In the public sector, while we've had to take the difficult decision to freeze pay for many public sector workers, we again have shielded the lowest paid. Those in the public sector below the median income will see their wages rise this year by at least £250. And since 2010, we have raised the personal tax threshold to £12,500, something that benefits the least well-off the most. Whether it's paying 80% of people's wages or providing the self-employed income support scheme designed for those earning less than £50,000, we've protected renters, we've helped with mortgages, and we're delivering the targeted support needed to help families with their council tax, food, energy and bills. We've continued to prioritise the least well-off. Meanwhile, Madam Deputy Speaker, the leader of the Labour Party characteristically offers only division and indecision. Last week he said he wanted more restrictions on our economy, but won't tell us what they could be. He's told us he wants to scrap our Brexit deal and do his own, but won't tell us what that will include. And now he said he wants to scrap universal credit, but won't tell us what would replace it. Sadly, since the first lockdown in March, the number of people claiming universal credit has doubled. Yet the system has not fallen over under the weight of all this additional pressure, and I pay tribute to those outstanding DWP staff, especially those at my local job centres in Redcar, Eston and Middlesbrough, who've worked so hard to ensure this. The Labour Party can criticise universal credit and the DWP all they like, but they know that the legacy system they left behind would not have been able to cope with this increase in demand. And while we have invested in universal credit by doubling the number of job coaches to provide the necessary one-to-one job seeker support that we know works so much better, they would throw it all away rather than admit it is delivering exactly on the priorities of those who need it most. Work is the best route out of poverty, which is why we have taken such extraordinary measures to protect as many jobs as we can. This government is rising to the immense challenge presented by a crisis like no other in our history. We are all in this together, and together is how we'll beat this virus.
Thank you. I'm sorry we haven't been able to fit everybody into this debate. It was heavily oversubscribed, and we had a statement earlier, and we have another heavily subscribed debate. So I'm now going to Shadow Chancellor Annalisa Dodds.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. With our country still locked down after record redundancies and with even more anticipated, it's astonishing that the government is still threatening family finances. Ministers could have come to this House and promised that there would be no cut to universal credit in April. They could have recognised the incredible hardship that families have faced in the last 10 months and are likely to face as we continue in the throes of this crisis. We heard the voices of many of those families today in speeches from my friends from Ealing North, Bermondsey and Old Southwark, Birkenhead, Bradford East and Belfast South. The cut to universal credit is just one part of a triple hammer blow on families across the country, when coupled with its council tax rise of 5% and pay freeze for many key workers. And while today we've rightly been focused on the immediate threat to the incomes of 6 million families, we shouldn't forget that those on legacy benefits, including the 1.9 million people claiming either form of employment support allowance and the 300,000 people claiming either form of job seekers allowance, of course have not received an uplift. Those payments must be uprated in line with those for universal credit. Now, the government benches opposed support for families against support for job seekers, but their choice to cut universal credit is a political one. The past year has seen the government spend £22 billion on an outsourced test and trace system that still isn't delivering. A quarter of that cost has been estimated as the cost for a continuation for a whole year of the support for families that we're debating today. And this comes from a government which has spent monumental amounts wastefully on goods and services that simply have not worked. £150 million on face masks that couldn't be used, 16 million on antibody tests that didn't work, 12 million on an app that had to be scrapped. The list goes on and on and on, as intimated by my friend for Ilford South. Instead of tackling waste and mismanagement, our government's targeting families, with the worst off fifth of households in our country facing what the Resolution Foundation has described as an almost unimaginable 7% hit to their disposable incomes if the government continues on this path. Cutting £20 a week from universal credit is a political choice to make ordinary families carry the can for this government's mistakes, as my friend from Merthyr Tydfil and Rumney rightly put it. Now, there are rumours that the Chancellor is considering a one-off payment of either £500 or £1,000 instead of maintaining the £20 per week uplift. If those payments take place at the beginning of April, people would miss out if they were affected by the end of the furlough scheme in April. So if someone loses their job on March the 30th, they would get £1,000 more to see them through than if they lose their job just a month later. There can be no economic justification for this approach. Furthermore, at times during this pandemic, we've had 200,000 new claimants coming onto this system in a single month. A one-off payment simply will not work. Now, I want to make clear that I and the opposition have no truck with those who abuse government members for their opinions or threaten them. We wholeheartedly condemn that behaviour, and it has no place in our democracy, as my friend for Stalybridge and Hyde made crystal clear. Now, the Prime Minister's spokesperson described our debate today as a political stunt, and other members on the government benches today echoed him. However, when the Conservative Party itself was in opposition, it did not consider debates such as these as stunts, nor indeed did the then Labour government. My right honourable friend for West Ham, in one of so many exceptional speeches made today, put his finger on the problem. This government has lost the capacity to listen. It needs to ask itself why a number of its own members, from that for Preseli, Pembrokeshire to Barrow and Furness, have called today again for the government to look at this issue and retain the uplift during this crisis. Now, the Resolution Foundation has shown how this cut, combined with rising unemployment, would lead to the biggest year-on-year rise in poverty rates since the 1980s and lead to a rise in absolute as well as relative poverty. My friends for Denton and Reddish and Oldham East and Saddleworth rightly highlighted the impact of this on child poverty in particular. The cut is morally untenable, but it's also economically nonsensical. What the UK needs as we come out of this crisis is confidence. Confidence that the government has got a grip on public health, but also confidence that people can afford to spend, to go out onto our high streets and into our small businesses. This cut shatters the confidence of those who are far more likely to spend than those who are better off. The cut also ignores the high long-term costs of poverty, as underlined by my friend for Wirral South. As highlighted by the Right Honourable Member for West Ham, this is a false economy. And finally, I regret that I have to mention this, but yet again, from the Conservative benches, we saw those claiming universal credit pitted against working people. Yet universal credit is an in-work benefit. It does not take money from everybody else that works, as the member for Bexhill and Battle suggested. And it should not be pitted against getting Britain back to work, as Right Honourable Member for Colchester and the members for Derbyshire Dales and Stourbridge maintained. My friends for Edmonton and Easington were absolutely right to point to the impact on claimants of such false comparisons. Now, these proposed cuts would disproportionately impact those in the north of England and in Wales. It's bad enough that 1 in 5 non-pensioner households in the southeast will be hit by these cuts. But in the northeast, in Yorkshire and Humber, in Wales and in the West Midlands, it's more than 1 in 3 households. The Chancellor might want to learn the lessons of his predecessor. George Osborne also thought he could cut an average of £1,000 a year from families' incomes. It took just over a month for him to see the error of his ways and back down. Mr. Osborne's cuts would have affected 3.3 million working families. The current Chancellor plans to take a hammer blow to nearly double that number, 6 million families across the country. Yet month after month, he has stubbornly ploughed ahead, ignoring the economic evidence, even ignoring 2 former Conservative Secretaries of State for Work and Pensions. Now, in conclusion, the Minister, when opening, stated that the Secretary of State was in active discussions with the Treasury. Well, on the Labour side, our DWP and Treasury teams have already had those active discussions. We've decided to prioritise families and our economic recovery, and we're doing something about it today. Madam Deputy Speaker, for all the talk of wanting to address inequality in this country, here is a policy choice from the Conservatives that would see 1 in 4 people in relative poverty by the end of this Parliament, and 1 in 3 children. Instead, our government should be focused on securing our economy, protecting our NHS and rebuilding Britain. Cutting a financial lifeline for 6 million people will not secure our economy. Enacting a policy that will plunge families into hardship, widen regional inequalities and make working people carry the can for this government's mistakes is no way to rebuild Britain. It's not too late for the members opposite to do the right thing. I urge them to vote with us today and send a clear message to millions of families that their elected representatives hear them and are on their side.
Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Steve Barclay.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's a privilege to close this debate on behalf of the Government. And let me begin by thanking Honourable and Right Honourable members from across the House for their contributions, many of which spoke with huge passion. And listening to the debate, it's clear that there is a heartfelt desire shared across all sides of the House to support constituents impacted by the economic consequences of COVID. And that was reflected in the well-measured opening remarks of the opposition front bench, and also in the comments of my honourable friends, the member for Sevenoaks, the member for Barrow-on-Furness, and the member for Guildford, amongst many others. And as a government, we are acutely aware of the harm caused by the crisis to people's finances, including the most vulnerable in our society. And at every stage of the pandemic, we have striven to support those who have found themselves at the sharp end. That's why, as my honourable friend, the Minister for Welfare Delivery, earlier outlined, we introduced a wide-ranging package of welfare measures worth over £7 billion this year. And this includes temporarily increasing the Universal Credit Standard Allowance and Working Tax Credit Basic Element by £20 a week, an increase which has boosted welfare spending by £6.1 billion. And as my right honourable friend, the Minister for Welfare Delivery, also pointed out, given the evolving nature of this pandemic, it is right that we wait until the budget to make future tax and welfare decisions. It is those on lower... Of course, I give way to the Chair of the Select Committee.
To him for giving way, but isn't it unreasonable to force families who claim universal credit to wait until March to find out whether the rate of benefit is going to be cut by nearly a quarter at the end of March? Surely the government needs to announce this decision sooner than that.
I think, Madam Deputy Speaker, what that ignores is a quarter of this scheme is still to run. There's still almost 3 months to the end of the financial year, and one should look at the package of measures as a whole. And as a number of honourable and right honourable colleagues pointed out, £280 billion of fiscal stimulus has been allocated by my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, to help weather this crisis. A number of measures I think the Chair of the Select Committee himself has welcomed. And indeed, as was further pointed out during the course of this debate, and as indeed Treasury analysis supports, these measures have overwhelmingly supported the poorest families most and have reduced losses for working households by up to 2/3. And indeed, that was a point very elegantly expressed by my colleagues, the member for Bexhill and Battle, the member for Meriden, and indeed most recently the member for Redcar, who correctly identified that the scale of government support had indeed been praised by many international observers, including the IMF, who signalled out the performance of the UK. And let me briefly remind the House of some of the key elements of that support that relates most closely, Madam Deputy Speaker, to this debate. The furlough scheme has protected the jobs of almost 10 million people, many of whom are on low incomes. Over 3 million people have benefited from self-employment grants, while in addition to the temporary uplift in welfare payments, we have suspended the universal credit minimum income floor and increased the local housing allowance rates for housing benefit and universal credit. And we have supported those on low incomes through other measures too. These include council tax relief through the £500 million hardship fund, and the £500 payments for people on low incomes to self-isolate. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, our COVID winter support package, which includes the £170 million COVID winter grant scheme and a £220 million expansion of the holiday activities and food programme for disadvantaged children. Points made during the course of the debate, including by my honourable friend, the member for Rushcliffe. And indeed, these measures have provided financial support to millions of families and individuals. But beyond the state help that those measures have enabled, there can be no doubt, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the best way to raise living standards is to keep as many people in work as possible and to support their wages. And indeed, that is why my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, has focused on our pledge to end low pay by increasing the national living wage by 2.2% to £8.91 an hour. And he's gone further and also protected creating and supporting employment through our £30 billion plan for jobs, a point very effectively brought to the attention of the House by my honourable friend, the member for Starbridge. And indeed, it is measures, including the furlough scheme, along with a raft of other initiatives designed to get people into work, that has boosted the job centre capacity, doubling the number of work coaches, and sitting alongside measures such as the new £2.9 billion Restart programme to help over 1 million unemployed people back into work. But as well as helping people find jobs, we're creating new ones through a range of policies, and these include our £8.6 billion investment in infrastructure, decarbonisation and maintenance programmes, and our £2 billion kickstart scheme for young people. And over the long term, we plan to unlock 250,000 highly skilled sustainable jobs that will boost our recovery under the Prime Minister's 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution. Madam Deputy Speaker, I have set out to the House the scale of support we are providing to people in this crisis, as well as our commitment to helping the most vulnerable and those on low incomes. But let me add, that would not have been possible to provide that support without the dedication of thousands of workers in the Department for Work and Pensions and the front line in job centres around the country. And let me echo the remarks of my honourable friend, the Minister for Welfare Delivery, in pointing out how well the universal credit system has coped with the enormous increase in claimants over the past months, a point recognised quite rightly by my honourable friends, my right honourable friend, the member for Silly, Pembrokeshire, and my honourable friends, the member for Brecon and Radnorshire, and I'm sure colleagues will join me in wishing her a happy birthday, and my honourable friend, the member for Gedling. Madam Deputy Speaker, despite these immense pressures, payments have still been issued swiftly and efficiently to millions of people through the universal credit system. It is clear that every member of this House is concerned for the financial well-being of families and individuals in their constituencies and across the country, and that has been reflected in the remarks from all sides of the House during the course of this debate. The government too is acutely aware of the challenges people face. That is why we have spent £280 billion in response to COVID, reflecting this government's and this Chancellor's commitment to support individuals, businesses and our public services. As such, Madam Deputy Speaker, we will not move an amendment to this debate.
The question is the opposition motion as on the order paper. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Aye. Division, clear the lobby. The question is the opposition motion as on the order paper. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. Tellers for the ayes, Bambos Charalambos and Jeff Smith. Tellers for the noes, John Speller and Jill Furness. Lock the doors. Order. Order.
The ayes to the right, 278. The noes to the left, 0.
The ayes to the right, 278. The noes to the left, 0. So the ayes have it, the ayes have it. Unlock. Point of order, William Ragg.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My apologies to the honourable members for Worley and Sheffield. Perhaps I've not been able to give prior notice of my point of order because they were on telling duties. But I was concerned at the calling of that division, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the advent of face masks in this chamber may have disguised a member or two of the opposition whip's office of also shouting their opposition to their own motion, thus rendering redundant the idea that your vote should follow the voice. Could you advise further to that, Madam Deputy Speaker?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for that point of order. Nothing disorderly has happened. There was a shout of aye, shouts of no. Tellers were put in when I repeated the question when putting it again. So I'm sure he's not questioning my judgment. So there's nothing disorderly that has happened. The vote took place in the proper manner. Thank you. I will now suspend the House for 3 minutes in order to enable the necessary business arrangements for the next business to be made. Order. Order, order. We now come to the second Opposition Day motion on access to remote education and the quality of free school meals. I inform the House that Mr Speaker has selected the amendment in the name of the Prime Minister. I call Shadow Secretary of State Kate Green to move the motion.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I beg to move the motion in my name and in the name of my honourable and right honourable friends. Today, and at least until February half-term, millions of children have not attended school and will instead be studying at home. No one wants to be in this situation. We all believe that school is the best place for children's learning and their well-being. But for now, faced with a rising coronavirus infection rate, we understand that many children need to study at home. They, their families, and hard-working school staff deserve to know that the government is doing all it can to support them. That's why we have brought forward a motion to the House which asks two fundamental questions this evening. First, is the government doing everything it can to support pupils to keep learning remotely? And second, is the government doing everything it can to ensure that children do not go hungry when they can't get a free meal in school? If the answer to those questions is no, which I believe it is, then members, whatever their party, should vote for our motion. Because these should be matters on which we can all agree. I'm sure there's nobody in this House who does not believe that children